What you're about to hear is an exclusive episode of One Dime Radio that would normally be available for patrons only, part of the Backroom podcast that I do for patrons. I decided to make this episode in particular public because there seems to be some confusion regarding my views on immigration due to people taking some things that I say out of context, while my patrons have been well aware of what my stances are. So I decided to make this Backroom episode public to everybody. It features Benjamin Studebaker, a frequent collaborator of mine, author of the book The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. He has a PhD at Cambridge and is generally one of the most insightful guests I love to talk to on a frequent basis. We basically have a show together, and this was one of the episodes for that. I think this was one of the most important episodes we have ever recorded. It is a nuanced discussion of immigration, and I think everyone would benefit from listening to it. And I think it'll challenge a lot of people to think about the binary between right wing and left wing views on immigration and what both the far right and the left often get wrong. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy the episode, and this will give you an idea as to what you get out of being a patron of One Dime Radio, the type of content that you get on a weekly basis for patrons only.
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I'm not saying I'm going to rule the world or I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee that I will spark the brain that will change the world, and that's our job. We might not be the ones, but let's not be selfish, and because we're not going to change the world, let's not talk about how we should change it.
By moderately conservative, I mean simply, before you act, think well about all possible consequences.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
You want to do politics, you got to fucking understand the issues. It's not all just emotions and fantasy life.
Remember, my friend, a wise man can learn more from a foolish question than a fool can learn from a wise answer.
Welcome to the Back Room. I'm here again with Benjamin Studebaker to talk about immigration. We're going to have a nuanced discussion of immigration, which was sparked partially by a conversation we had off air. Look, man, I'll start off with this. We need to have a way of discussing immigration that doesn't buy into the dichotomy that it's either you have to blame immigrants themselves and push hatred towards them, or just act like there's no problem going on and to not think about it. And with liberals, they tend to respond to immigration. At least things are changing now in Europe, but for like the past, decades before very recently until the rise of the far right, the liberal response has been to just say, no, immigration's good for the economy, and that's why you should support it. Leftists, I see still today, they tend to respond to immigration by just saying what effectively amounts to, let's not think about it, other issues matter more. Like, this is a distraction from the class war. And they take any discussion about immigration as a distraction from the class war that ends up pitting immigrants against, native citizens, as opposed to the real class war between the bourgeoisie and the workers. That's the way I see them respond to it. It's like we need to have a way of discussing, actually talking about it. I will be making a video on it. I've already written a script, actually, called Immigration, What the Left and Right Gets Wrong, but that probably won't be out till the other video essays are out.
So I think something that everybody on the left recognizes is that capital mobility is consequential. If you have a lot of money that moves from one place to another place, a lot of money entering one place very quickly creates a bubble. A lot of money exiting, capital flight, creates trouble. You can have jobs move very rapidly from one place. You can have jobs move too rapidly to another place, putting pressure on the infrastructure in that other place. If it's money that's moving around, there's an understanding that rapid movement of large amounts of money is destabilizing for territorial states that are locked in place. This is also true for people. People and money have a lot in common. People, larger numbers of people means more expenditures on public services and infrastructure and housing, right? And then if you have a lot of people who leave, then you have a lot of empty, vacant infrastructure and housing. You have a bunch of public services that you've built that you don't actually need to use. So, of course, one of the problems, and this is a problem many people will admit exists, is brain drain. So brain drain is the case where a developing country loses a lot of its talent to other countries that pay higher wages for that work, or have better living standards or better living conditions or better public services, and so are able in all these ways to attract some of the brightest and most talented or most educated people from other states. And we all recognize that this blights the states that suffer from the brain drain problem. They lose a lot of talent, and this means they lose an opportunity to innovate, technologically develop, to become leaders in particular sectors or industries. Huge losses occur to states that suffer from the brain drain problem. Conversely, if you have a very large number of immigrants who come into a particular territory in a short space of time, this means much higher costs in a short window of time to the territorial state, territorial polity that they've moved into. And that territorial polity will not necessarily have immediately access to tax revenue, money that's been lent in the form of bonds, or printed money to meet the immediate near-term needs that this creates. And what's more, there are social cohesion problems that arise when you have very large numbers of people from a different place come into one particular place in a short window of time. An example, when I was in high school, I told you this story off air. We had at my high school a non-trivial number of people in our graduating class, high school in Indiana, public state school in Indiana, who came from immigrant families. So they were the sons and daughters of immigrants, often from Middle Eastern, Indian, or East Asian extraction. Our graduating class had maybe 500 people, and you would probably have less than 5 from any particular country, or even, in terms of region, you might be talking about less than 10. So there might have been 5 to 10 students from the Middle East, 5 to 10 students from India, 5 to 10 students from East Asia in a graduating class. You would have maybe a little bit less than 10%, 5 to 10% of the graduating class would be children of immigrants, and then there would be diversity in terms of what country those immigrants were from. As a consequence of this, the students who were the sons and daughters of immigrants had to interact with us to have social lives. It was not possible for them to click up on the basis of ethnicity or language or religion and only talk to each other. That would not have worked for them socially. So there were social relations. As a consequence of the social relations, we got to know them and they got to know us. They learned how to move in American society and culture. So they gained important social skills that were valuable to them in their careers, that they could not have gotten at home from their parents who grew up in other countries. And conversely, we got exposed to them. We saw that they were not that different from us. They didn't pose any kind of threat to us. They were perfectly fine, normal people that you could date, that you could be friends with, you could hang out with. There was no reason you couldn't do any of those things. Now, I had many friends in high school who were sons and daughters of immigrants. There was absolutely no problem. My best friend who lives up the street has a Guatemalan ancestry, loads of this. After I left, there was a debate in my school district about whether to accept a proposal to take 50 students from China in one graduating class, all from the same country, and add them to our high school. And the idea is that China would pay our high school a sizable amount of money, or somebody in China, some group or interest group in China would pay a sizable amount of money for this, and then there would be cultural exchange. I opposed this on the grounds that 50 from one country is too many from one country, given that the graduating class is 500 people. You can fill up lunch tables with people all from the same place in that setting. And that means that there is a possibility of clicking up, and that means the social relations won't take place. And that means that there will be a lack of understanding. And in fact, not only will there be a lack of understanding and cultural exchange, things will get worse. There will be racial tension, there will be ethnic tension, and it would produce a situation in which they would eventually go back home and feel negatively about Americans, and we would feel negatively about them as a consequence of that interaction. And I said, if it was 10, it would be great, but it can't be 50. That was my view. Now, in our community, anyone who opposed this was called a racist. Anybody who opposed it was said to be Chinophobic. And still sometimes, 10 years later, this issue comes up, people raise it. And because eventually the proposal was turned down because a lot of parents opposed it. And the people who supported the proposal still to this day believe that everybody who was against it was racist and xenophobic, and that it was East Asian hate, and that was the only reason anyone could possibly have for having opposed it. This is, I think, the character of the current immigration debate. There is a level of immigration in any society that is not just sustainable, but good for people who come, good for the people who are there, good for mutual understanding, social relations across different cultural barriers, religious barriers. But there is a point at which you take too many immigrants in too short a time span from too specific a place, and you put them into too small a space in too short a time span. When you do that, and this is all spatial and temporal, it's not about the essence of the group or the essence of the culture or the difference in the cultures. It's not about that. It's about time and space. Too many people, a number too large, in too small a space, in too short a time, that produces racial tension. I think everybody knows this at this stage. And what happens when you get racial tension? The right politically will benefit from that. We have seen this happen repeatedly over and over again. Nevertheless, the argument is always that if you raise this point in any kind of public setting, then you're part of the problem. People will talk about this in non-public settings. Many elites will say behind closed doors that they recognize that it's a problem and that if there's a refugee crisis, the right will benefit politically from that. Many elites will say that, but they don't want to be seen to have this view. So oftentimes you'll have a situation where the right will make a show of enforcing immigration laws while not actually doing that much more than the liberals do when they're in government. And the liberals will make a show of not enforcing immigration laws when in point of fact, they are trying quite hard behind scenes to do just that. And so in point of fact, the difference tends to be in the optics. Now, the optics do matter because if there's a perception in developing countries that the immigration laws aren't being enforced, then the border crossing rate tends to go up. So under Donald Trump, until there was an increase in the budget for ICE, my expectation was that there would be a reduction in border crossings because of the change in the rhetoric, but not because of any substantive increase in the capacity to do enforcement. Now that they've tripled the ICE budget in the large omnibus bill that they passed, there is a real possibility that they might deport a larger number of people than they have done historically. And we're waiting to see the numbers to get a sense of exactly what is going on. There are all sorts of reports. People are seeing all kinds of things ad hoc, but we don't know exactly what the scale is of what's taking place. But what I would submit to you is that this is a consequence of a perception that the Biden administration was very lax. And that perception came from a feeling that you should not be seen to be opposed to immigration in any context, regardless of the particulars. And I think that position is not a credible position. And I think in practice, it means that people believe that the only way that they can see any kind of regulation in the rate of migration is to support the political right, which is not true and has never been true. It's never been the case that you have to support the right to see any level of immigration regulation.
As we're seeing in Denmark, actually, which was one of the few places where a left-leaning social democratic party was able to win partially by addressing that problem. But that was seen by parts of the left as them merely becoming the right instead of, stopping the right, because don't get me started on that. The thing is, there's so much to pick apart in all what you said, because you identified various subtopics in this broader topic of immigration, which are all very important. You started off with brain drain, then to assimilation. And I think those are two big parts of immigration that represent different issues. Let's maybe quickly tackle the the brain drain one very quickly, because I think that's a less contentious one with leftists. That's one you can get leftists to admit. A while ago, for those who want to know, some of my thoughts on immigration, a while ago, I had maybe about 2 different tweet threads at different points that articulated some of my thoughts on immigration. And the part about brain drain was not really, no one really refuted that, but basically, so I actually, in fact, yeah, I do think immigration's a problem, but how do you address that? You have to get one at the cause, and you also have to, because you can't merely be reactive. You have to get at the cause of it. But that's not to say you should have open borders. So I wanted to be super clear and say that, like, I think you do need border control, because the basic fact is that if you don't, that's a very blatant incentive for more people to go in, right? As you just mentioned, that's part of, like, the strategy of the Trump admin, is to create fear, the perception that there's strict border enforcement, which will deter people from coming. And the problem liberals have is that liberals, in fact, have taken the issue seriously in trying to implement changes, but because they can't appear politically incorrect and appear as though they are doing this because this will piss off parts of their base, they, in rhetoric, act as if they are, cosmopolitan, open borders, when they're in fact not. And that's made it easier for the right to frame, like, the Democratic Party as if they support open borders when they just simply do not. Obama was strict on immigration. Biden was very strict on immigration. It's, Bernie Sanders, who in 2016 was willing to say open borders was a Koch brothers policy, and that the policy should be to make the people who have been in the country for a long time, who work, who do not commit crime, to be citizens, while having strict border control to prevent this sort of, you know, mass illegal immigration. He was willing to say that in 2016. You had then anti-Trump derangement syndrome, and then Bernie Sanders by 2020, while having actually similar policy, had in rhetoric to act basically like a progressive liberal and act as if that the only way to talk about migration was either acceptance or racism. I think he very much capitulated.
On so
What?
many issues, he did that between 2016
Oh
and
yeah,
2020.
it's
Yeah.
almost like a different person. We're talking about 2016. Bernie was able to win off red states, and he was, So with the question of brain drain, I think that's the one that is people forget. There's a really good book on this called "Migration is Economic Imperialism," which was really highlights the degree to which this is all part of like the global capitalist economy, and in fact, you shouldn't view this as like people like the third world immigrants versus white first world. It's a really delusional way to see it. It is not good for a third world country to have people constantly leave illegally or legally. You know, I'm half Lebanese. That's like one country that has suffered significantly from brain drain. It's almost just a fact that if you have any money or career prospects whatsoever in Lebanon, you leave either to Qatar, to Dubai, or to the United States or Canada. And part of it was like this is the case now, even though there is no civil war, but it was especially the case with the Civil War. It is not good for the country. Let's also remember a lot of third world countries have very strict borders. Mexico, until, you could say 2016, perhaps. Not exactly, sure. It's debatable to what extent because there's refugee policy and then there's border policy. But on border policy, Mexico was stricter than the US for a very long time, because Mexico has all these other countries to deal with that they don't want to have tons of people pool in to Mexico, like, from Guatemala or El Salvador or Haiti. There's just many places where, Mexico has an interest in having strict borders too. So it's not just, it would be very American centric to act as if, I think what Trump has brought out is two things. Trump has been much more explicit in what the US immigration policy already was, starting with Obama. And he's also introduced another component to it, which is the kind of nativist component, which is where I think is more dangerous because he does, I think in some ways, the Groyper movement is a certain honest expression of something he was appealing to, but in a subtle way. like, the Make America Great Again, there was always that element there where, it wasn't clear who he's appealing to. What is it? He's talking about the 90s where you had immigration, but maybe not as much. Are you talking about the 50s? Are you talking about the 20s when America was more white? And that
Yeah,
opens
it's
the
a
door.
empty floating signifier that
Yeah.
is designed to be filled by whatever image of American greatness appeals to you.
And in any case, migration is economic imperialism. The other big element is that whole assimilation thing, which is a concern for every country. Now, America is, I think, quite exceptional. America, Canada, but America is even more than Canada in some ways. It was probably the country the best at integrating immigrants as citizens. You can find that great Reagan speech that I always love to show Trump supporters when he says, "You can go to live in France, but you can't become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany, but you can't become a German. You can go to Turkey, you can't become Turkish, but anyone from any color, country can become an American." And George Bush had said more or less similar kind of things. And that's all
Mm.
true. But that integration is only possible when you have people from many different places coming in small quantities, not huge groups of people coming all at once and then having less of an incentive or ability to integrate because you can just stick among each other. That's a real issue. Why can't we just
Yeah.
talk about that?
The
That
density
itself,
question.
which opens the whole Clash of Civilizations thing inevitably, right? Because Sam Huntington raised this he talked about this in a very different way. And any
Because
discussion
Huntington
of,
thinks there's a fundamental cultural difference. He thinks that there's a specific issue with Latin Americans that makes it such that they can't be Americans.
yeah, very different from
Whereas,
what we're saying.
yeah, what we're saying is that, of course, Latin Americans and people from any place can be Americans, but there's a process by which that is most likely to occur that is sensitive to things like space, time, density. You have to do it at the right speed. You have to do it with the right number of people. You have to do it in a reasonable way such that this outcome can actually happen. Because if people are able to move to a place without intermingling, without having social relations with the people who already live there, the people who already live there will see them as hostile or strange. All the word hostile just means is strange in Latin. To say that someone is hostile is just to say that they're strange to you and you don't know whether you can trust them. So if you have a large enough number of people come into a space such that they can strike you as hostile, then there won't be social relations. And then those social relations can give rise to civil bonds over time. They can, but only if those social relations first take root. And this is the thing that people are not really properly wrestling with. The other thing, of course, if you want to control this, you can't just control it at the level of the border and at the level of border security.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a question of establishing order and hope and standard of living increase in the countries that people are fleeing. So if you
Mm-hmm.
have a country that has been turned into a mess with a failed state, civil conflict, then that is not going to be a country that people are going to stay in. And part of the
Like Haiti,
story of the last,
Venezuela.
yeah, part of the story of the last 20, 30 years is that there are a lot of countries that have been broken and never properly put back together. And so these countries become unsafe places that people are wanting to get out of for completely understandable reasons. So then it just becomes a question of hot potato, with different countries trying to avoid absorbing too large a number of refugees or migrants. And it becomes a question of who's going to get caught holding the bag. This way of doing migration policy, where it's a bunch of countries playing hot potato and trying to see who gets caught holding the bag, is no sensible or reasonable way to control the problem. It requires that order be established in the countries that are struggling with a serious standard of living increase. And that may not look immediately like something that we would all, enjoy seeing. It might look very capitalistic. It might look very nasty in its early opening stages. But if you can get to a stage where you have a more reasonable level of migration that's more manageable, then you can have an internal conversation in the rich countries that is less focused on us versus them. Why are these people here? What are we getting ripped off? This way of thinking, which comes about through having this occur too quickly, can be lessened and softened. And then it becomes possible to talk about other more constructive things that we might do to make our world better. You don't get rid of the immigration issue just by refusing to discuss it. You get rid of the immigration issue by actually making it not look like a plausible explanation of what's wrong. You have to change the situation so that immigration does not appear to be the plausible explanation of what's wrong. And part of doing that is actually making it the case that immigration is not a plausible explanation of what's wrong by changing the way immigration policy works and by changing the living standards and conditions in the countries that people are tending to flee. One of the things that has happened in the European Union is that the countries that initially produced a lot of migration and had a lot of brain drain problems have been the recipients over the last 15, 20 years of an enormous amount of investment. And as a consequence, they've gotten a lot richer. And as they've gotten a lot richer, their governments also have played up nationalist rhetoric to try to create a sense of attachment on the part of the population to those countries so that the people are less likely to leave. The effect of this is that countries like Poland and Hungary, that were in the opening phase of the post-Cold War era, countries that produced an enormous number of migrant workers for Western European
That's
countries.
right.
Now there is more economic development in those countries, a greater sense of attachment on the part of the people who live in those countries to those countries. And so it's no longer the case that there's an enormous number of Poles or Hungarians coming to Western Europe every year. The Eastern European migration question has faded from European
Right.
consciousness. It's not an issue.
I mean, you
And
remember
indeed,
the
we
90s,
wouldn't be seeing,
predominantly Eastern Europe. In the 90s, it was
and into the 2000s. Yeah. 05, 06, 07. When I first came to the UK for undergrad in 2010, the immigration question was mainly about Poles. It didn't become principally about the Arab and Islamic world until not just after 9/11, but after the refugee crisis in 2014. That's when really the tenor of the debate shifted.
And, of course, the left, how the left will respond to that. They'll say the reason why it's a big deal now is because a lot of the immigrants are brown and it's a race thing. And, to some extent, yeah. But what I'll respond to that with, we've, what I think gets overlooked is, race is a modern construct. Xenophobia is not modern whatsoever. You could arguably, xenophobia has been around as long as humans have been around. It's an instinct that is a reaction to, as you said, what is unfamiliar. It's funny that hostile has etymology of literally like, what is it? Not, unfamiliarity.
The stranger.
The stranger. This is a total thing that is true. If you look at any history book that talks about Native American societies, you'll see that there was often a lot of fear of other tribes, of other nations. And while you would have internally egalitarian societies, that'd be very hostile to each other from the outside. And,
Indeed,
there
this
was
played a role in facilitating imperialism because when the Spanish came to Mexico, a substantial number of the tribes in that area sided with the Spanish, went to the Spanish for help against the Aztecs. And this is also something you'll see the Romans talk about in their histories. When they would come into a region, there would be some group in the region that would recognize that the Romans were powerful and potentially in position to help them. That city or small state would ally with the Romans, and then the pretext of defending the ally from somebody else would give the Romans a reason to come into the region. If you read Julius Caesar's Gallic War, this all begins with, we have a friend who's being harassed by somebody deeper into Gaul, so therefore we're going to go deeper into Gaul to go after the people who are harassing the friend. This is how a lot of this kind of stuff gets going. And it gets going because there can be deep hostile relationships within what you might think of as civilizational blocks or cultural groups. There were plenty of Gauls who hated each other more than they hated the Romans. And that is what allowed Julius Caesar to come into Gaul and penetrate it. And the same is true over and over again in so many different situations and contexts.
we have to acknowledge there's a total ugly side to human nature, and leftists love to deal with the question of human nature just because human nature evolves and changes and is socially, partly socially conditioned over long periods of time, I should say, which makes a big difference because, they take that to mean human nature doesn't exist or that you shouldn't think about it. I actually think it's one of the biggest flaw in leftist thinking, honestly, in liberal thinking, because that's actually where you saw really the view on human nature that many leftists is originally a liberal enlightenment view. You know that human nature is just infinitely malleable, and that's why like so much change is possible. We forget how savage so many human societies really were, and part of why, like this instinct clearly, despite, a more internationalist, globalist world order, it's changed, but to a extent. People who live with many different people who look different, like myself, I went to public school. I, it's funny, like my friend group was extremely multi-ethnic, people of various different countries. I'm the son of immigrants. I have many friends who are sons and daughters of immigrants, very common in Canada. So it's like, it's not really strange to you, but it's always usually people in rural areas, people
Yeah.
who don't encounter a lot of immigrants, who are most fearful of them. For example, in Quebec, Quebec is often portrayed as it's like overall just xenophobic, but Montreal is actually one of the wokest cities in the world. It's
Often
annoying.
there's a proximity. There's a proximity of these things. Yeah.
Parts of Quebec is
Place
xenophobic.
the place where the immigrant is strange is often in great proximity to the place that is very much trying to paper over and make up for the fact that it's near a place that thinks like that. So there's a kind of overreaction. I notice this a lot on the West Coast, where there's a
Liberal
sort of
guilt.
Californian liberal thing, which is
Mhm.
continuously reacting to and provoking reaction in a kind of Rocky Mountain, Utah Mormon thing.
I was
Produces
gonna
a
get
much more extreme discussion than you would otherwise get.
I was gonna get to that after, like the root reasons as to why the left and liberals don't deal with this problem, and I think it is, it'd have to do with their sociology. But with regard to this problem, okay, you can say these people just need to be educated. These people, this okay, but education doesn't is not experience. You don't make people who are xenophobic not xenophobic by telling them they're xenophobic or racist or whatever. They
And
have
it's
to
not something you solve at the level of concepts. It's something that you resolve by actually creating social relations over a prolonged period of time. Sustainable social
right.
relations where people both seem to benefit from it and therefore want to interact more.
And and it's like the only way for that to be solved is by urbanizing everybody, which is not gonna happen. Newsflash. It is not gonna happen. You can't just urbanize everybody without huge reaction. There was this fantasy among some people, some liberals wanna, push everyone into the dense urban cities. Have you heard of half Earth socialism? It's actually a kind of a environmentalist left-leaning idea where they wanna conserve half the
Rewild
earth.
half the planet.
Yeah, and push everyone into urban cities.
Yeah. Do a half Coruscant, not the full thing. There is also the possibility that you can have social relations and a multi-ethnic, multicultural thing, which is still totally barbaric. At the Roman Colosseum, you would find people from all over the Mediterranean, and they would all be cheering for blood sport. This is also totally possible.
That's part of why actually I'm a big supporter of sports. I think sports are great. Leftist intellectuals who hate on sports are idiots because sports contain and sublimate the savagery of humans. They do. And it's what a better way to do it. What better it's much better to be violent with at a sports game than it is to, start a civil race war. Okay? And look, when it comes to this assimilation thing, it's, when sometimes I hear people talk about the Israel Palestine conflict and how it emerged, some say, okay, the Arabs just didn't like that so many Jews were coming. They were xenophobic. And some leftists will say, Actually, no, they took them all with open arms. There's an element of truth to both. It's like they only started being hostile
Of
once the Israelis
course.
were segregating. I would say no, they
Right.
had a right to some extent to be xenophobic. That's what every human group does. When you have a lot of people who are not like there's not a trust between different people all come at once, there's going to be that reaction. There's a part of a rationale in that because for much of humans, it was different tribes conquering other tribes. This is baked into like human history,
But if somebody is saying that the purpose of their moving to a place is to demographically
especially
take
if
it
they
over
say
so
that.
that they can establish their own rules in that place.
Especially if they say that.
There's a documentary called Wild Wild Country about a guy, the Rajneesh, who set up a weird sex commune in Oregon, in rural Oregon. And his strategy was to move so many of his followers to this area in Oregon that they would overwhelm the region demographically and therefore be able to get elected to government offices and change the laws to allow all sorts of weird behavior to take place. And
Insane.
this is something that sometimes people do. Sometimes people think, okay, here's an area that's relatively low population. There's enough of us that we could potentially establish a majority in the region if we all moved there and then go there and then attempt to do that thing. And the Rajneesh and his followers were not interested in establishing social relations with the locals in Oregon because their goal from the beginning was to demographically outcompete them and politically dominate the area. So they really didn't do anything to try to prevent the people in the area from organizing against them because they assumed that the people in the area would be hostile to them and to their goals. And then, of course, as a consequence of this, what they assumed would happen came into being. There was a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy to that. And then the Oregonians organized to eventually make it impossible for the Rajneesh to operate. This is a case that you can read about on Netflix, and it's, not read about, watch on Netflix. And it's a case of a cult leader trying to do this in a US state. There's lots and lots of different versions of that are possible if you get the numbers that way. A lot of the time, we don't think about this in terms of suppose that there were 1 billion people on the moon who all wanted to get off the moon because there wasn't enough good air there. And they all decided that if we all move from the moon to one particular place on planet Earth, then we'll have a lunar majority and we can run it however we want. There's no country on the planet that would be happy about that. And it has nothing to do with the culture of the lunar people. There's nothing specific about the lunar people that I need to include in the example to make the example make the point. They
Yeah.
don't have to have any particular religion or skin color or ethnicity or anything. It's just 1 billion people from one place coming to some other place. You're going to not be able to absorb that without major change.
The only
But
way
could you, if there's a refugee crisis on the moon, take some smaller number of those people or take some people from the moon gradually over a longer period of time? Of course you could. And maybe that would be great.
the only way to have a lot of people who are from a very different socialization, different environment, different culture, ethnicity, to come into a foreign place is assimilation, and that is gradual, and that is only possible when you have only a few people come at a time, because the more people you have, the less incentive there is. Because it's hard and it's understandable. If I was, for example, if I wanted to move to Japan, like many white guys fantasize about, okay, for whatever reason, if I wanted to go to Japan and Japan was filled with Anglos, I would probably end up just not learning Japanese and hang out with the Anglos. That is what a lot of English people do in Mexico, for example, in certain cities. And you know what? The Mexicans complain. Rightfully so. Are they racist? You know, it is the integration is a real big problem. And look, I'll give it in Canada, which is one of the countries that is so usually almost like a shining example of like liberal cosmopolitanism because it can do immigration very well, like America. And part of why that is also is because there's not a, clear native culture that white people in America and Canada can really claim to be part of, because they're not the indigenous people. There are settlers, they descendant of settlers. So there's not a legitimation claim against immigration quite as strong as like in any European country for that matter, where, the Irish, are indigenous to Ireland, right? So they can make a much stronger case. In Canada and America, it's been harder to make up any objections to immigration due to this. But I'll give an example. So, look, the changes just in the last 10 years have been so rapid. I remember, no one had a problem with Indians in Canada. My neighbor was Indian. He's, born in Canada, socialized in Canada. He, practiced Hinduism due to his very conservative parents. Super Canadian, talk like the rest of my, friend group, It was very, tons of Canadians of different cultures, ethnicities. No one had a problem with Indians. Indians often actually, interestingly voted conservative, as you find a lot of second gen do, especially if they have conservative values.
There's
In
a
fact, there's
significant amount of that in the United States as well.
Oh, yeah. There was actually a political scientist a while back, 10 years ago, Daryl, I forget his last name, but he wrote The Big Shift, where he predicted the Conservatives would become the natural governing party of Canada instead of the Liberals due to the immigration, because the immigrants tend to vote more conservative, and he predicted this. What he didn't predict is the way in which, the right actually would, totally fail at capturing this immigrant vote by, freaking out about niqabs in Canada during the Syrian refugee crisis. And with the lefts, the
Yeah,
big
and
point
often
here.
people who make demographic destiny arguments prove wrong from whatever political vantage point, because
Mm.
as the group moves, it does change. The group does not remain precisely the same. The
Right?
question is, can you change it in a way which improves the quality of social cohesion over time? Or is it going to be something that's going to produce tension and cause the group tension to take over the politics and become the dominant thing?
It's almost as if they presuppose like assimilation not happening. In that,
Yeah.
what tends to happen is after the next generation of immigrants, the second generation, they tend often to be quite critical of a lot of immigration, especially groups of immigrants that are perceived to have gotten there a little easier and much faster than, where it breeds a sort of resentment where it's like, I worked hard to integrate. I worked hard to be a citizen of this country. Why are people just getting handed out citizenship like this or just handed out
Yeah.
visas? There's a sort of a disdain for that. And that's real. You can't blame that on racism. They can call it, oh, it's internalized racism. There's all these copes. But what matters is the outcomes and effects. In Canada, people had no problem with Indians until very recently. In 2015, the rate of immigration went up super rapidly in the past 10 years. It's gone up insanely rapidly, largely due to universities, including the known ones and the illegitimate ones that are just frankly scam businesses, in my opinion, finding it very profitable to bring in tons of Indian immigrants to basically pay money for degrees and be promised opportunity, which they often weren't given because wasn't realistic to begin with, and also by the Indian government, I should add. A lot of
Yeah.
companies in India who would, have these packages that would make it easier to facilitate immigration from India to Canada, largely due to not just and I should really preface, it's not just Indians. It was mostly Punjabis, all going to very like, 2 areas. Toronto, particularly Brampton. It's not just it's Toronto mostly, but highly concentrated in Brampton and Surrey in BC. You at this point have Little India in Surrey and Little India in Brampton. Some people will say that's racist to say everyone fucking knows it. Every single person of every race and ethnicity in Canada who actually lives here knows that's true. It is a basic fact at this point. It's to the point where you had gang wars between Indian Sikhs and Indian Hindu nationalists in Canada. It's ridiculous. And that's why you had started to have a rise of Indian sentiment. People wonder, "Oh, such a rise of anti-Indian sentiment." Yeah, I would agree. It's not good to, like, blame every Indian for this. It's foolish. But you can't just act like this came out of nowhere. This is a result of basically the government thinking it was financially convenient because it was good for our GDP to import tons
Yeah.
of Indians all at once into a few places, and that's what you
It's
get.
too
And
much too fast too soon. Too
if
much too
Canada
fast too soon.
Right. And if Canada finds us too much too fast too soon, imagine Europe, where it's way more dense and way more culturally homogenous, culturally and ethnically homogenous, with languages that are far harder to learn often. So now it's like Canada got a tiny little tiny sliver of a taste as to what the Europeans have been complaining about for years. So I
Yeah.
just want to say, like, how do you deal with this? You gotta deal with it. You can't just put your head in the sand. And I saw a perfect example of the left's inability to deal with this, which made me realize, okay, it's necessary to really talk about this more. Because before I used to buy the idea that talking about this played into the right wing culture, where increasingly I've realized actually not talking about it plays into the right. Perfect example of this was there's this famous guy, a right wing influencer in America, in the UK, Carl Benjamin. I think he used to be called Sargon of Akkad. He made a
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah, he's a big, Reform Party guy, and he was saying something about immigration, and the left a big leftist Twitter account posted a meme where it said, "It's not the immigrant that's the problem, it's the bourgeoisie. It's the rich. It's not the people versus immigrants, it's the rich." And then he replied by saying, "Who do you think wanted to import immigrants the most? The rich." Or at least not the rich, but rich people, rich capitalists. And that he could the leftists couldn't deal with that at all, and this is the big problem. This is the big
Yeah.
part, the contradiction.
Yeah. There is, I think that the European Union had a strategy for enlargement that acknowledged that there was going to be tension on the basis of the migration that would take place, but that this would be throttled such that tension would not politically overwhelm the expansion project. And it would ultimately be beneficial for all parties. So you would have some Poles who would get to move to Western Europe. You would get investment in Poland, which would gradually grow it over time. Poland would develop into a significant market, would then be a market in part for goods produced in other European countries. So it would generate growth in other European countries. And this would all happen because the EU was able to, in tranches, absorb very specific numbers of Eastern European states on a particular timeline. What has happened more recently, it's not that the migrants are no longer Eastern European and they come from some other cultural group. That's not the principal issue. The principal issue is that it's now no longer controlled because it's not the EU deciding, okay, we think we are ready to absorb this country and that country in this year. It's, oh no, a giant mess has occurred in the Middle East or in North Africa or in the interior of Africa, and the people have come up to North Africa and are crossing the Mediterranean Sea in boats. What do we do about this? Who's going to take these people? Who's going to pay to have boats patrol the Mediterranean Sea to make sure that people don't drown? And now it's a bunch of countries fighting with each other over who's going to do this task. And then, in an unplanned way, large populations of refugees, in particular European cities, with the authorities unable to build infrastructure, unable to ensure that there's appropriately integrated schools. You have a de facto racial segregation problem in a lot of European school systems now, where by default, there are immigrant schools and there are native population schools. And it's not an explicit policy, but by default, this is how it tends to go. And this is what, in practice, many of these countries now have. This does not work. It's very difficult once you smash a country into little bits and allow roving bands of people to get going, not just migrant groups, but then also groups that attempt to establish order and do this through criminal activity, drug gangs, terrorist groups like the Islamic State, and so on. This tends to produce spiraling, endless, continuous, endemic violence. It often spreads from place to place across national borders and keeps this going. And once this gets going and it keeps going, now you're in a position where it becomes very hard to control it in any way, shape, or form. There's no appetite to make large-scale investments or large-scale interventions to try to reproduce stability in the countries that have been shattered and destroyed. And there is no capacity to build the infrastructure domestically inside European countries to absorb in a reasonable time limit these large inflows in a way that's socially functional. So it's really a very difficult problem. And I think it should be admitted first that it's a difficult problem. Genuinely, and a question of resources for a European continent that has had no growth at all, really, since the pandemic. Part is a consequence of the Ukraine war and the energy costs that the Ukraine war has generated. And how did all of that get started? It got started in part because there was an effort to include more Eastern European countries in the European Union, or to, if not put them in the European Union, then at least make economic deals with those countries to develop them into good markets for the European Union. And this put Russia in a difficult spot because it meant that Russia was potentially going to lose economic opportunities. And then Russia broke the rules. The rules are that you're supposed to compete on carrots and not on sticks. You can offer the Ukrainians your own economic development package and let them choose. But if you say to the Ukrainians, you have to take our inferior economic development package or we're going to hurt you, then you've broken the rules of the game. The Russians broke the rules of the game. But they broke the rules of the game because a larger carrot was offered to them by the European Union, offered to the Ukrainians. It wasn't NATO membership that was immediately on the table. It was an economic development
You're
package.
talking about 2014, right?
Yeah, in 2014, an EU economic development package that was too good for the Russians to compete, except by moving from the carrot to the stick. But our international rules say you don't ever go to the stick. You only compete on the carrot. And if you lose the competition on the carrot, then you just accept that you lost. You're less competitive. Your economy is less competitive, and you're supposed to go do things to make yourself more competitive. You're not supposed to go to the stick because you lost the carrot measuring contest.
And this is the danger. We have this international capitalist system that creates all these issues. What liberalism has often been in practice as an ideology, and I would say more broadly progressivism, because I prefer to use the word progressivism over liberalism because it ties in leftism. Leftists love to distance themselves from liberals, but progressivism is where their shared ideological tendencies are really seen. And progressivism, frankly, is often an ideology of decay, and that it doesn't necessarily cause the decay, but it rationalizes it. It'll try to see what is happening and trying to flip it, instead of really dealing with what's happening. It'll say, diversity is our strength, right? This is the classic thing. Diversity is our strength. Oh, it's good for the economy, right? And that's often countered. It's good for the economy.
Yeah.
Now,
and yet, a lot of these people will acknowledge that there's enormous economic inequality inside these societies. So if you say something like it's good for the economy, it is not at all obvious that means it's good for every section of the
right.
society. Obviously, especially in countries with increasingly high economic inequality, growth is not necessarily going to be shared growth. It's not going to be experienced widely. And sometimes you can have growth with certain sections of the population experiencing it as contraction.
It was quite revealing because I was watching this debate between Gary Stevenson. It was not a debate face to face or anything. They just responded to each other. Gary Stevenson, Gary's Economics. He's a British kind of left leaning, center left commentator. Has been very popular. I quite like the guy. He's very good at explaining certain ideas of inequality. But he had this commentary on the Reform Party, and he was just saying, what matters more is the rich, and the rich are trying to divide us. The very classic kind of leftist talking point. And he was saying, you should care about your living standards more than whether England is becoming, having more immigrants or not. What was quite interesting was the much more popular response of Carl Benjamin. And it reflects a response I've been seeing from people which is, we don't care whether the economy grows less because of this. Whether or not, we do not care. In fact, his explicit response was, I don't give a damn if the economy is going to grow less. I want England to be England. You saw elements of this with Poland before. You know, this is increasingly a sort of weird right-wing degrowth talking point that I've been seeing,
Yeah.
which is,
I think they might be able to get away with saying that they don't care if there's less growth. But I think they would find, and indeed they will find if they get into power and try this sort of thing, that if they do shrink the economy, they will not be able to sustain what they're doing politically.
we're already seeing that. So a good example is Italy.
Yeah.
So Meloni in practice is someone who's like extremely anti-migrant, but under her rule, we've seen a big decrease in illegal immigration and refugees, but actually an increase in legal immigration, to boost the economy. So it's not like she's necessarily keeping Italy Italian, but she did, control with illegal immigration. So it's in practice, what you can do is very limited.
Yeah.
But
particularly for an EU state.
Oh, yes. But
with a Mediterranean coastline.
I do even want to say, though, so like this idea of keeping England English, keeping France, that itself is often taken to be a racist argument, and in a certain sense, it is. But it's also, let's do a thought experiment here. If China said, or let's give a more realistic example, because China is very ethnically diverse itself. Let's say Vietnam. Vietnam had tons of white people moving because they love the cheap cost of living. They like Vietnamese women. They're a bunch of passport bros. Started going to Vietnam. You can say it's a different circumstance, sure, because it's, people who are wealthy are coming as opposed to people who are poor are coming. But if the Vietnamese said, we want to keep Vietnam for the Vietnamese, is that racist? The question no longer is it racist, is it justified? And, they probably would say yes. If, what I'm trying to say here is that the impulse to say keep our country of a certain, to not have it basically become a low trust society, which is what they often explicitly say, is not totally unwarranted. In that if you have
and that's a very different point, right? I don't want it to be a low trust society. There are a lot of different ways that you can have a high trust society. You don't necessarily have to have ethnic homogeneity to have a high trust society. Mm-hmm. If you put it in terms of what kind of social practices you want to see, you're having a very different discussion versus I just want a country to be an ethnicity. That's a very different kind of claim.
And that the trick, though, is that some people who say they want to keep England English are sometimes saying out of sheer racism. And I think, that's where you get a kind of difference between why, I tend to be less sympathetic to like upper class French racists versus working class ones, as a very different character. For a lot of people, it is about trust, in that it's about people who grew up in a certain community. That's what's familiar in their life. And they go to Paris and they see Paris is just a bunch of tourists. And it's a bunch of, now a lot of immigrants. They're like, wow, Paris is not what it once was. I don't want my place where I grew up to be like Paris. Very common thing you hear. Are they completely wrong in saying that? Because that's the thing. Where does more low trust? The village? Or even the smaller town? Or Paris? Probably the smaller place. And the only way to have multi-ethnic societies without it becoming a low trust society is to have it be slower so that those people can integrate. And I do think that a lot of blame does need to be put on the French, who the French often are notorious for being very bad at integrating their citizens. Like, for example, there's plenty of French people who speak perfect French, but they're just black or Algerian or Arab. And they often are treated quite poorly. That is as true. A good example is the French.
And some of this is a consequence of the terrorism that was committed in Algeria, which broke down social relations specifically on racial lines. The terrorists in Algeria targeted the French because they were French and tried to create a perception among the French that all Algerians were potentially dangerous to them. They succeeded in doing that, causing the French eventually to leave. But the consequence of this is that the French still mistrust people purely on the basis that they look Algerian.
Yeah, it's and it's difficult because then we get into arguments of justification, which it's like,
You know,
Algeria is colonized,
getting rid of
so
imperial, yes,
yeah.
there's all
Wh
sorts of different things going on there.
when this is where you get the contradictions come about and, like, where cope and solution really very much conflict. You'll sometimes see this set of talking points with leftists or liberals, which is it's like especially with leftists, actually. They'll start off by saying, "What's wrong with mass immigration? It's good for growth. Diversity is good." What are you don't you against diversity? Are you a racist? And then you'll say, "Okay, but like if you have too much at once, it's bad because it might create a low trust society, it might be harder to integrate, you might have strains on the welfare state, yada." Strain on the welfare state is nuanced because that really depends on the skill level of immigrants coming in and whatnot. But okay, let's just say that the trust point. They'll respond to that often by saying they colonized the third world, so it's their fault. But then that
Then this just becomes a blame game. It's no longer about how can we
exactly,
go forward together in a way
and
that
also
works. We could also say that the Angles and the Saxons and the Franks are settler populations that came into the Roman Empire and were barbarians. And how could you possibly absorb so many of them without barbarization occurring? And yet, nonetheless, over the course of a very long period of time, it was possible for Britain and Gaul to absorb and to ultimately transform the social and political character of those populations which crossed into that territory. And those populations all came from Germany and all were Germanic and now think of themselves as something else. This is far enough back in the past that people try to dismiss this and say that it doesn't matter, but it is, of course, evidence that if you have enough time, you can change any group of people into any other group of people, given enough time. But if you try to do it
right.
very quickly in a very short span of time in a very small territory, then of course that's not going to happen. And the Romans experienced the migrations of the Angles and the Franks and the Saxons as a major problem because it was so many of them in such a short span of time.
And also just the whole white guilt, they colonized the third world argument undermines the first argument, which is like, okay, which is it? Is diversity a strength and is this good? Or are they like paying the consequences for their actions? It really undermines both points because you can't believe both at the same time that like this is a benefit to the country or they are suffering the consequence of imperialism or whatever. These are very different arguments, and to hold both, it just makes you look like an idiot. And that's the problem with the left and liberals on this issue. Especially, I think the left's worse on the issue, frankly, because the liberals, will try to deal with it, but then will act like, they'll take on a leftist rhetoric. The left shows that, signals to a lot of working class people that it's not really serious about dealing with this issue and doesn't want to think about it. The question is, why? Is it just because they're idiots? I, you know, I think a good indication as to why they do this. I know it sounds funny, it's like just because 'cause they're idiots, right? It's like, no, it's
It's the
where
way
they
you put that.
that's about it because that's what it might, like, sound like to some people. It's like, are we just saying leftists are dumb?" It's not really dumb, they're out of touch. Why are they out of touch? They literally are out of touch, and that's the
A lot of
socialization.
them have given up on being able to win in Western countries. They've decided that Westerners are imperialist to their core and therefore not amenable to socialist organizing. And since they've given up on the Westerners as a subject, they imagine, therefore, that revolutionary possibility must come from some other place and then brought to the West. And if you're thinking like that, then immigration is potentially a vector for transforming these countries into something that might be more tractable for your politics.
But beyond that,
It's not that, though. It won't work out that
right.
way. A
Well,
big mistake.
I would boil down the reason for why the left hasn't been able to respond to this into 3 main things. And, I've cited this study multiple times, Thomas Piketty's The Brahmin Left versus the Merchant Right. It was about Europe. He was identifying a lot of the things that people have now talked about in the United States and Canada way earlier in Europe. And it is this education divide that,
Yep.
Benjamin has talked about in his own work a lot. This education divide, where people you have a class of people who go to universities in urban areas mostly, or university towns, which are in practice urban areas, with the expectation that they are going to be in a social strata above the working class. What you get is then people who are in a different qualitative position from the working class, or people who are struggling to be part of that higher strata and want to justify the fact that they spend a bunch of years of their life studying this shit, and they want to convey their difference in another way. So this manifests in two ways. You get the politically correct limousine liberals, who are cosmopolitan elites of a sort, who are out of touch from the rest of the working class, very out of touch from the rural communities, and even the suburban communities. And then you get fallen professionals, which you've written about a lot, which I think tend to be more leftist. Often I think the psychology of the leftists is usually they're fallen professionals, hence why they take a more anti-establishment character. And in both cases, the reason why to a lot of the public, they both appear as liberals. It's not just because they're undereducated, it's because they speak in similar ways. They speak in this PMC language. They
They have the
both
same training.
cosmopolitans. And the big thing, we've talked about PMC in this show a lot, but what was not talked about as much is the two other factors which are connected to this broader thing, which is one, white guilt, cosmopolitanism, rootless cosmopolitanism in particular. If you are used to living in a big city, right, where you encounter a lot of different people, especially if you're in Europe, where you have the luxury of going to different European countries, you take on a sociology where you're like, that doesn't really matter. Like this idea of tribalism, localism, it's all just primitive. Why can't we just all be human and all be friends? I am someone who understands this very well as a multiracial Canadian who has had the luxury of going to different places, of meeting different people. I understand this very well. So I understand the way these people think. You understand this very well too, being in academic
Yeah.
circles, going to England, in Cambridge of all places, right? You
I
look at
tend to
the
just feel a little bit alienated from everybody now, you know? Being transatlantic really just makes you feel not quite at home anywhere. I was at a high school reunion recently and felt almost, on the one hand, these are people that I've known for a long time, many of them, who are from Indiana, from my local community. But there was some part of it that felt like I was touching grass or something. I was interacting with something that I, on the one hand, know about intellectually, but I'm often not really connected up with. And I'm trying to be able to relate to it in the way that perhaps I once did, but it's a struggle and I have to make an active effort. And what it does is it makes you not totally at home anywhere. And it makes it so that you don't really fit anywhere and don't really belong to any place. So then part of the way that you deal with that is by saying that maybe place doesn't matter
then you
because
end
you
up,
don't have one.
and that's also why I think, okay, so like, a lot of the left says the problem is just that people are too xenophobic. They need to be educated to not be xenophobic, and then no one would worry about immigration. But you know what? The lack of xenophobia is itself a privilege. It's a result
Make
of
it so that
privilege.
everybody can be cosmopolitan and you'd have a whole different kind of society. But of course, there's no economic possibility of doing that in anything like a reasonable span of to have any kind of effect on any of this. If you really want to give everyone that kind of form of life that results in a cosmopolitan way of approaching things, you would have to completely change the way everybody lives. You'd also have to have an enormous amount of money spent on heavy carbon intensive flying. You'd have to fly everybody everywhere all the time.
I'm also, I'm not afraid to say it. I also think that vision of like everyone being cosmopolitan is fucking horrible and dystopian. There's something weird, and I've written about this in an article called "The Rational Kernel of Corporate Communism," which is there is a weird way in which capitalist liberal ideology and communist ideology sometimes overlap, which is that they both believe in an international world system where everyone is the same. Like this is the envision utopia. For the liberals, it's liberal democracies. Everyone's liberal democracy capitalists. For the communists, you have everyone's a communist state. It might seem like I'm strawmanning here, but the point is you get in the irony, right? Is of course the people who usually believe in this sort of communist fantasy are usually themselves people who are quite high in the hierarchy of capitalism. They're in the PMC place, PMC strata, or want to be part of it. I actually think, though, that vision is quite dystopian for a lot of reasons. For one, there's a beauty of different cultures. I've always loved visiting countries partially because I like learning about different cultures. It would suck if every place was a big cosmopolitan basket case where everyone's from everywhere. You really would
Well,
have a kind of, very different arrangement. Like, for example, look, I'll give another example. When I went to Japan, I was a very clear outsider.
yeah.
And it's like, that's fine. I am an outsider. That's fine. When people sometimes question, why do people care about immigration? Why is it a problem? Why do people care about tourists? Why do people complain about tourists? Let's be honest here. You complain about tourists because you hate seeing people who aren't familiar with the culture there in big amounts, not really attempting to like blend in. And the more people you
Also, they
have,
often raise your cost of living.
oh
And a
yeah,
lot of the businesses are owned by people from outside the community in question. So the money that they generate often doesn't get to the people who are having to
right.
deal with them on a day-to-day basis.
Oh yes, yeah. There's
I think that you could have supranational or international systems that are designed to facilitate pluralism and which could safeguard pluralism to a much greater degree than a bunch of nation states competing with each other for money can ultimately do. There is a way of thinking about internationalism and supranationalism so that it facilitates and sustains a possibility of pluralism by qualifying the competition among states that would otherwise occur, the military competition and the commercial competition that otherwise would occur. It's possible to make it more achievable for different cities, different polities to emphasize different things or prioritize different things. It's when you're in a situation where if you don't conform to a particular logic, you're going to be conquered or you're not going to have any jobs or any tax revenue, that everybody is forced to converge. And
Mhm.
this is really the core reason everybody's becoming the same is that there is no break on these competitive mechanisms now. All of the nation states are in an international system which is not designed to protect them from these competitive logics, but is instead designed to subject them to those logics for the purposes of transforming them into the kinds of societies in which you can generate an enormous amount of capital in.
yeah.
So
It's my point about cosmopolitanism was more so that I think, it's fine to have urban cities. They've existed for a very long time. It's nothing new to have urban cities where you have migration from all sort of places, right?
yeah.
Like, I think Toronto's, I think right now the most, if not, it might have actually surpassed New York as the most multi-ethnic city in the world. And I think that's beautiful. There's something utopian about Toronto where you can get food from just about everywhere, right? But I also don't want every place in the world to be Toronto. I don't want every place in Canada to be Toronto. I don't think that would be good, right? Like, like it's good to have urban centers that are hyper cosmopolitan. But I don't think you can or should try to want to make every place cosmopolitan. And I think that's a question worth raising because the only way to like the only way to deal with the xenophobia problem is either you slow down the rate of immigration so you can actually make people be citizens, or you would just make everyone urbanized so that it's normal to like have, people to be around multi-ethnic areas. And that's one, as you mentioned, very like nearly impossible. And two, I would just say not desirable. It's not desirable either. That you really would then get the kind of right-wing fear of the decline of culture, I think. If you just had
Well, there's
every
all that, the 15-minute city stuff and all of that numtot stuff that really creeps the right out. All of
it
that,
creeps
the
me out
walkable
too.
cities. Yeah.
Walkable cities, I don't know, like walkable cities is a problem, but like the idea of just everyone
Oh,
in these
walkable cities, meaning no cars, meaning you don't
yeah,
have to maintain the infrastructure for cars, meaning people can't decide, oh, I want to go drive somewhere else. Limitations on where you can go. The right in the States doesn't have trains on the basis that trains, meaning that everybody goes to the same places and
right.
people don't have options to go other places where there are no tracks and no train stations. The limiting of the possibility only
Oh
to
yeah, I
the
see.
kind of
Yeah.
infrastructure. Yeah, that's the concern. So
No,
the walkable implies the not drivable.
yeah, no, I would say, the line I take on that is you don't want to make everyone like China, basically, which is where the world you depict is.
How would you
But,
even have enough consumption to support the global economy if everybody lived in those tiny flats? the huge houses that people have, sure, they're disgusting, but they allow people to buy all of the stuff that is made
I would
because they have
so
a place to store it.
I would say so, like, I do have a beef with suburbia as a concept because I
Mm.
think suburbia is weird where you get, like, the environmental destruction, but you also don't get the community that you would get in a local place where people still can drive. In the sense that people are, like, in these, like, boxes all isolated, you know? There's almost also, like, a similar kind of decline of culture in suburbia in its own way.
Yeah, I grew up in an
Depends
exurb.
on the suburb. Like,
Uh,
not all suburbs are created equal. In Vancouver, the one where I have family who
and
lives is
suburbs and
actually quite nice.
exurbs are different.
Yeah.
Yeah, the suburb that's near has a level of density to it that is very different from the exurban suburb. You can be an hour or an hour and a half from a downtown of a major metropolitan city and also be within 10 or 15 minutes of open rural cornfield. And when you're in that kind of situation, you sit at the border between worlds and it gets very strange. And you feel like you have the ability to go and have whichever one whenever you want it, which of course isn't possible for everybody else. Most people are in a city and they don't drive much, and it would be very difficult for them to get very far out, or they're in a rural area and they would have to go an awful long way to get to a big city, and they are not accustomed to that kind of environment, might even be scared or intimidated by that kind of environment. Living in the exurbs, you feel like you can get a little bit of anything whenever you want it. And I do think it induces a little bit of spectatorship behavior because there is this sense that everything is a la carte. Everything is when you feel like it. Urban life is when you feel like it. Rural life is when you feel like it.
Yeah.
But this is what's really attractive about living in suburbs the way they were originally conceived, with real space in between the houses, a little bit of, real yard. It creates the sense that you really can have whatever form of human civilization you like whenever you choose it. And it's not scalable. It's not possible for everybody to live in an exurb. Exurbs quickly become inner suburbs. And once they're inner suburbs, they're much less pleasant to live in.
Yeah.
But the fantasy of the exurb is incredibly powerful.
It's
And that's why
interesting.
people are always moving out to them. Every generation, people try this thing.
In Vancouver, it's interesting because Vancouver seems to do suburbs much better in that there's just a way to get from suburb to city easily. You can just take the C bus, and also you can drive the bridge pretty easy. The suburbs are also like they've tried to like facilitate community by designing houses in a particular way that are more less overly spacious. It's worked a little better than compared to like where when I think for that it's hard to give an example, but that everyone would understand, but maybe listeners who know of Canada, maybe Ottawa, I'm thinking of Canada and like Orleans and places like that. Like they're just very like suburbs. People, you don't have communities. Even where I grew up, actually in Nepean, which is one of the better suburbs in terms of being closer to downtown. It's still very like there's some neighbors where I never even knew who they were. People aren't as friendly as in like local areas. Like where the your your neighbor who's like a little further down still. But yeah, so back to the sort of point. Okay, so like what drives obliviousness when it comes to the issue of immigration? Rootless cosmopolitanism. If I don't belong anywhere, then what are these other people who are so attached? Why are they so attached? It's tribal. Come, we're better than that. You have this sort of attitude. The other attitude is white guilt. Big driver of this sort of thing. The white guilt, you know, leads to people treating these big political issues the way Catholics often deal with sins, which is to just confess and get it out and move on with the day. And I see leftists deal with this by saying stuff like, the Germans are notorious for this. We did the Holocaust, yeah, so therefore we need to take all the refugees, yeah. And it's
Backwards thinking. Yeah.
yeah,
Why do people think that justice is about the past? Why can't justice be about the future? Why can't we think about the conditions for a better kind of world as opposed to trying to rectify what cannot be rectified? The Germans can never fix the Holocaust. They always will have done it, and they can never fix it and never make it right. And all of the trials that they had at Nuremberg, none of that fixed any of it. None of that made any of it right. None of that created any justice at all. What happened in the Holocaust can never be rectified at all by anybody ever. And anyone who claims to have rectified it has failed to understand what it is. And that's true with every one of these terrible wars and atrocities. Once it occurs, you can never make it right. There is no quantity of money. There is nothing you can do to bring people back to life and bring cities and towns that have been destroyed back to life. No one ever fixes any of that. All we can do is move forward and try to make things better. That's all we can do. And as soon as people start talking about the past, what it says to me is that they don't really appreciate the incredibly horrific things that have occurred and the absolute terrible quality of them. Yeah. If you think that taking refugees makes the Holocaust even an infinitesimal 0.1% better, your way of approaching moral issues is completely flawed. There is no fixing any of it ever. They just have to live with it. The Germans, like everybody else, can move forward and contribute to a world that's better than that world that we all know about. That's what they can do.
Yeah, and it's annoying too because, the common argument I hear, which, leftists use to turn their brain off, is like with England and France, right? It's like, oh, they did imperialism, so, sucks to suck. But I'm thinking like, it's like, what is like what does the average working class person in France or England have anything to do with, what fucking, you know, Benjamin Disraeli did, or Winston Churchill did? It's just ridiculous.
And every population group in the world, if you go back far enough, there's a time when it was migratory. There's a time when it moved to that area. There's a time where it displaced and killed the people who were there. There is no population group that is so thoroughly goingly transhistorical that you can't tell a story about that at some time or other. And in the cases where that seems to be the case, it's usually just because we don't know what happened, because we don't have good enough written records of the period, or we don't have good enough language skills to decipher what there is. There is no population group. Italy was invaded by the Lombards. Italy was invaded by the Celts. Italy was invaded by the Greeks. Italy was invaded by the Carthaginians. Every place that is on the planet has been invaded and invaded and invaded many times. And it's just that people don't know about these things and choose arbitrary points at which to decide who started where. This is not how we make the world good. It's not by taking some snapshot of the world at some year and going, this is where everyone naturally belongs.
It's really ridiculous, and it all sounds really ridiculous when you identify the contradictions, and that's why the question as to why is this the attitude? You got to look at the sort of incentive structures, and that socialization, the sort of PMC white guilt is a big thing, because when you have people who are in a certain level of privilege, they feel a guilt, and the way to get rid of that guilt without thinking too hard is to do this sort of posing as politics, as Adolf Reed brilliantly described it. You get this like performative politics. And it's not just white guilt, I should say. It's just like PMC guilt, because, I would have seen actually just as common is people who are like, for example, part black or fully black or in part indigenous in Canada, very common. And they're PMC themselves. And they feel the need to like, they feel that they were way more privileged than their ancestors were, and that they need to make up for this privilege by making, the white people pay for the crimes they did to their ancestors.
This is a good point. I think it's affluent people guilt. It's people who seem to have been successful guilt. It's guilt that people who have made it in this system feel because they know on some level that this system is not great and could certainly be a heck of a lot better. And they have not devoted their lives to changing the system or to making it dramatically better. They have not. They have found a way to fit into it and to do well. And then they think by flagellating themselves and then making pithy gestures that they can make up for the fact that they're not contributing to changing the system or making it a better world. I'm not here to blame those people. I don't think that the world would be a different place if the affluent people who flagellate themselves just stopped doing that and did something else. It'd be nice if some of them did. But
Actually,
I also don't think that saying this, these kinds of things will change that.
it's also
It's
at
something
least
that comes out of the system.
it's better to be self-aware. I think self-awareness is important. For example, I like to be very self-aware that I'm PMC, and I've been PMC for probably the last 5 years at least, if not more, maybe 7, 8. And part of my, respect for the working class is not driven by being working class in a literal sense, but due to a sheer respect for people who do the work that I fucking hate to do. I hate
Of
manual
course.
labor. I tried work that avoided manual labor. I became a lifeguard. I became a camp counselor. I became, a tennis court. I freaking worked for the government. I just did jobs that did not involve what I felt to be mindless, just mindless menial manual labor. So it's like part of my respect for that is like the fact that people do it when I don't. It's not this delusion where some people like to LARP themselves and sing the working class just because they're wage earners, right?
Yeah, there's some of that. There's
A
also,
lot, a lot of people, it's
something
like,
that
let's be
blows
honest,
my
if you're
mind.
adjunct professor, sure, you don't get paid well. But you're not like classically working class. You're not the same as a person who works at Denny's and that they don't go to college.
Yeah, you get an elite education. Yeah, it's a different kind of experience. There are people with elite educations who are, impecunious, but that's different. Just the fact that somebody knows the word impecunious and what it means, that itself is indicative of something different. But I wanted
I
to
actually
say
don't
one of
know
the
what that
things that
means. What does that mean?
it means that you don't have money. You're temporarily embarrassed because you
Impecunious.
don't happen to have money at this time. The impecunious aristocrat is someone who is an aristocrat, so is an elite in some sense, but doesn't happen to have the money that you might associate with that elite.
Oh, yeah, I remember. Okay, never mind. Yeah.
Yeah, the impecunious elite is the person who is elite
Yeah.
in terms of their culture, their
I produced it.
socialization, but they just don't happen to have the money right now at this particular time for some contingent reason that surely will be resolved before too long. So don't worry, just give him a little credit and hopefully it will work out, is the typical attitude. But I wanted to say one of the things that I find amazing and have always found amazing are the intellectual types who want to claim, and some of them I'm sure it's true for them, but it has never been true for me, but who claim that picking objects up and moving them, the work of the hands or something, is this incredibly satisfying thing that we need to do to get back in touch with who we are as human beings. I'm sure there are some people who genuinely feel this way, who are otherwise educated, elite types. I have never found this to be true. If
I
I
hate it.
spend an hour picking things up and moving them, and then I look at the evidence of my physical work, I just go, okay, I can't get myself to care about that. I
I
have
hate
met,
it. I hate
I've met
fixing
people
things
who
in my
derive.
house. I
So
hate
let me tell you,
fixing things.
let me tell you a funky story. So my fiance, her father, for a while, he owned farmland, and some of the farmland was wooded, and he owned this land as a kind of retirement project. And what he would do is he would go to the land and he would find all of the invasive plants from Asia that were growing on this in this North American forest, and he would remove and destroy the invasive plants. So he would try to return the forest to its North American character by removing the Asian invasives from the forest. And he would do this with his friends. He would get his friends together and they would go out to the land and they would get rid of the invasives. And he'd do this year after year. He could never get rid of all of the invasives. Those plants have come to the United States and they're well adapted to the United States and they've spread all over the United States and no one will ever get rid of them. They've changed the character of North American forests and that's the end of it. It's a fait accompli. Nonetheless, he derived great satisfaction from trying and failing to do this Sisyphean task repeatedly over a series of years. And then eventually, his friends got busy because they had grandchildren and they, didn't come out as often. So he decided, I guess it's over with, and he sold the land off. And now I'm sure it's full of Asian invasive plants in all of the places where he had temporarily, for a period of time, managed to fight them off. For some people, this is incredibly therapeutic behavior, but I have never understood it at the level of myself. I have never been able to derive any satisfaction from anything like that.
Yeah, for me, I could only the only manual work I could do, manual labor stuff, if I could have like ear pods and listen to audiobook while doing it. It's like, it's like Dave, honestly. Actually, Dave did that for a while when he was at Amazon. But even then, it's like I would hate to do that. But it makes it more
He's
bearable
doing
if I
that
could
on the
listen.
farm.
Yeah, if
He's
I
moved out to a farm and he's
right.
doing that there now.
Yeah, no, if you can do that, like it's like actually no, I would prefer honestly. So it's not even a manual labor thing, it's just a kind of labor thing. If I could do the intellectual stuff while doing the manual labor, like that's chill. And that's where where I gravitated more to jobs where I could do that. But what I would hate actually the most, honestly, even more than physical manual labor, much more, is having to socialize with people all the time. Like that would be the night end of me. Oh my god, I could not be like a salesman. I could not be honestly, I could like I've always avoided like service jobs like the plague. Oh man. There was a period where I was debating I was like whether I was gonna work at Zara or a place, like H&M. And then I thought, oh my god, having to like talk to people all the time about oh, I would hate it. I like to distract myself and escape while I'm doing the work. Escape into my autistic fixations, you know?
There's a little bit of a new left post-work tendency in most millennials who have any kind of left sympathy. There's a little bit of it, at least a little bit of it. And the reason that the New Left Project was as attractive as it was is that there are lots of people who want some kind of post-work thing, want technology to deliver that. And it's not as if there's never any movement in that direction, just never enough movement on a time scale that's relevant to us. Maybe at some point in the future, but that's always what they say, isn't it? And meanwhile, there's still an enormous amount of work that needs to get done. And those of us who yap and those of us who write benefit enormously from the people who do that work, whether they do it because
It's
they
true.
like it or they do it because they're forced to do it by the threat of starvation and homelessness if they don't. We just
Indeed.
have to accept this and make the best work we can make and make it a little bit with them in mind. If you're trying to theorize a way to a better world, make sure it's a better world that includes that person you know from school I met somebody at my high school reunion who's working as a snowplow guy. He's plowing streets in the winter. He's somebody who is never going to listen to this kind of show. And I'd like it to be the case that whatever I do in some way, shape, or form might benefit him or people like him down the line. But I don't ever pretend for a minute that my life is anything like his life.
Right.
He used to get detentions and Saturday classes for fun because he just felt like getting them. He felt like doing stuff that would get him a detention. And he didn't really think about it or care if it did. He lived a very different kind of life. And he said, his philosophy is he could be dead any time. So why not do things that he wants to do?
Interesting. Is that maybe is this situation a little different in America? Because in Canada, actually, snowplowers are often usually public city employees, and they get paid pretty well. It's actually what I
Well,
like
he,
about
he,
Canada.
yeah,
I like the minimal, tiny bit of socialism we have, which is our
they're paid
garbage
by
truck
the state
drivers
of
get quite
Indiana.
paid pretty well, and like
Yeah,
snowplowers
they're paid by the
really well
state of Indiana, but they're paid very badly. He was telling me
because
about
this
how
is
one time he was called out to Michigan to help out Michigan,
for us they're
and
unionized because it's one of
the
the only
Michigan guys are
industries
getting
that's unionized. Interesting.
much better deals.
Yeah, in
It
Canada, it's
varies
weird.
state to state.
It's the public sector unions in Canada that are oddly like the strongest ones, and the private sector ones are like hardly existent at all. Like the public ones have far more power. It's not that strange when you understand the world economy, but yeah, the worst job I ever had was actually that I found the most unpleasant was actually being a camp counselor, having to like fucking talk to kids all the time. It was the most annoying thing ever. And probably because I was pretty young when I was doing it too, so it's like that back then you don't really,
Yeah.
unless you're a socialite, that is, where you can go. But anyway, to not get off track. Okay, so when it comes to the why the left and liberals are often out of touch, there's the PMC, there's the guilt, the cultural capital aspect, the different habitus in which people are socialized. The other thing, and this I would say is more a liberal thing, which is less so the fallen professionals. It's also just it is often a leftist academic thing too, but it's I would say like the technocratic mindset. The
Mhm.
technocratic mindset, and this is another thing I know pretty well going to school that was deliberately aimed at creating technocrats. The technocratic mindset is very much based on like how do you manage people because you're primed to become a manager. How do you manage society at the level of politics? Viewing people very much like economic units. And that's why I think the technocratic mindset leads to why you have leftists and liberals who think that, GDP going up is enough of a reason for people to not care about immigration, right? Like, oh, why do you care? It helps the GDP. The other thing is that like they often point out stats, which I do think are important to point out, by the way, which is like that immigrants, both illegal and illegal, actually do not commit more crime than natives, than native
Mhm.
citizens. In fact,
Yes,
usually
that's true.
commit less crime because they're trying to stay there. They don't want to get deported. And so they often commit less crime. That's important to say because sometimes the right will say they commit crime as a way to hide the real reason why they're against the mass migration, which, often has
Yeah.
to do
It's a
either
way
with
that they try to popularize their politics with people who would otherwise be skeptical. They make wild claims about crime.
the criminals, the rapists, they're bringing drugs. But it's like, look, that's why in some reason I find parts of the far right who are a little more honest about what their politics is that when they say let England be England, they're being more honest about sometimes. And but the thing is, I wouldn't deal with that by just saying, "Oh, they're racist." It's like, "Oh, this is gonna happen when you get, people come in big amounts where it's harder to, socialize. You're gonna get that happen. The question is, how do you prevent this from leading to something where it's dangerous? Because right now they're dealing with it by deporting illegal immigrants. That's the way what the far right wants to do. But what if that's not enough? What if that doesn't deal with the problem, and then you start seeing people on the far say, "You know what? We're not gonna deport illegal immigrants. We're gonna deport legal immigrants who are just, I don't know, born like they're first generation immigrants." Or we're gonna start,
Yeah.
whatever, like
Changing the law to make it so that if you don't have citizenship, yeah, you're potentially not given indefinite leave to remain, or that's revoked. Yeah, I think that's some of what they would consider. You can't deport citizens, although part of the trouble is that negative precedents were set about denationalizing people over terrorism
oh,
in
yes,
the
yeah.
2000s and in the 10s. In the UK and in Australia, people were denationalized on the basis of having supported terrorist groups, and that set a negative precedent in terms of what can be done. Once you say somebody's citizenship can be taken away
Yeah.
on the basis of their behavior, that's a very negative precedent. Now, that did not happen in the United States.
Well,
In the
Trump
United
might have
States,
made that
people
happen.
have not had their citizenship taken away, and there's no legal precedent in the United States to allow that. One could yet be
Trump's
established,
trying.
but that has not yet happened in American
Mhm.
law. But it has
Yeah.
happened in a lot of Commonwealth countries. A lot of Commonwealth countries
They tried
have
in
set
Canada.
legal precedents for that.
Yeah, Harper tried in Canada with one particular terrorist incident.
Yeah, anything that they can do to the category of terrorist, before too long, they can do to a much larger category of people,
Mhm.
either by reclassifying those people as terrorists or by expanding the set of categories to which those principles apply.
This is the one sense in which I think is the good thing about the US Supreme Court, which is pretty shitty on a lot of things, but, they do prevent this kind of thing in the Commonwealth countries. Part of why it's
Typically, yeah.
easier is because they don't really have a real Supreme Court. They do, but it's not like it can't block the executive.
Yeah. Power has to be based on an act of parliament, and therefore anything that a court would do that would disappoint parliament potentially could mean that its powers could be circumscribed by that parliament. Yeah. It's the centrality of the parliament in those British influence systems.
Yeah, that's the funny thing is our systems are both more democratic than US and actually far less in other ways, They're more
Yeah.
dictatorial.
Parliament is sovereign.
So, yeah, this technocratic mindset, okay. Because, like, I really did process this for a while when get the debate with Gary Stevenson and Carl Benjamin, which was, Gary Stevenson saying it's about the living standards. You should care about the living standards. And, this is an argument that I'm pretty sympathetic to because, that I do view like inequality is more important. But it's like, how do you deal with that rebuttal, right? When you say, okay, life's about more than living standards. That really gets to the heart of a deep philosophical issue with a lot of leftism and liberalism, which is their kind of atheistic materialism or their broader view that it's like these Homo economicus, which in a way the left accepts, especially the Marxists, who do, take a Homo economicus view of a lot of things. Let's
Yeah.
remember, Marx thought the whole revolution was the basis of working class interests.
A lot of people could use a dose of Plato, and just a dose, because this kind of stuff where any human value that can't be translated into a very narrow set of things is just treated as mysticism or fantasy stuff. This is not a way of mediating across meaningful plurality. You're not going to be able to have a conversation with people if you say, if I can't translate your values into something like GDP or something like principle of utility. There's an Epicureanism to a lot of the left that is quite limiting in practice. In fact, Jacobin, when they launched, in their launch manifesto, they described themselves as Epicurean, which I take seriously. I think they really meant it because they put it next to the word internationalist. And I'm sure they took that word seriously when
They're
they put that
scaling
word
back
in.
on that now, and they're getting a lot of hate for it, actually. They've
Yeah,
scaled back
maybe
on the
so.
internationalism. They've realized that was you know, they're look, I like to distinguish internationalism as a political goal and internationalism as a style of politics. I think internationalism as a style of politics is just that kind of rootless cosmopolitanism, which is a privilege, as opposed to, having goals that involve internationalist cooperation, which
Yeah,
is
there's a
different.
kind of aestheticized
Yeah.
internationalism, which is a kind of putting the cultural attitude before you've created the structure, the set of institutions that would actually make that sustainable at scale.
And then you become a globalist. That's how, that's why the left is often the reason why, like, you have to wonder, like, it's so ridiculous when the right says the World Economic Forum, which are, pretty much progressive liberals, liberal capitalists, are leftists and communists. They actually often use the word communist more than leftist. You
Yeah, they
gotta
talk about the WEF all the time. The WEF is just a talking shop. The
well,
WEF doesn't do
it
anything
doesn't. That's what I'm saying is that I look at it more psychoanalytically because why is the right so obsessed with the WEF despite its insignificance?
because the WEF talks out loud. And so the WEF seems to be the quiet part out loud to them. The WEF, they can actually take clips of people saying things and put them around the internet. But if you're looking at the IMF or the WTO, like you can go to the WTO's YouTube channel, they don't really give you very much to work with,
But why
because
is
the
it?
WTO's goal is to get stuff done.
But why is it?
Not the WEF's goal is to just talk.
But why is it believable that, this group of clearly liberal Davos elites could be communist? And this is an old thing, parts of the right, people can say this is the fascist the Bolshevik, Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, but it goes back before. There was a kind of older critic of Marx, actually, if you read a lot of like pre-fascist right-leaning literature. A big common critique was pointing out the weird thread similarities between Marxism and liberalism.
If you
And
don't achieve the socialism, then you will often appear and sometimes just be carrying water for liberal internationalism, for the post Cold War liberal institutions, which of course greatly limit what everybody can do. They have made a peace that has lasted a long time, if we're talking about great power war. But outside of that, they have greatly limited what everybody can do. They are golden handcuffs for this planet.
workers, when they say workers of the world unite, a part of me has always thought, do people who say that really believe that?
Because that would have to mean creating meaningful bonds of solidarity between workers in the Western countries and workers in poor developing post-colonial states. It would have to mean giving up this settlers versus indigenous, rich people, rich countries versus poor countries, labor aristocracy versus real workers stuff that people do, and thinking seriously about how could you actually have a bond of solidarity that could include a worker in West Virginia, a worker in Shanghai, a worker in Kenya. What would that actually look like? They say it, but most of the time they have the view that some number of those workers, one or the other, is irredeemable, is not somebody that you can work with, has to be transformed by some process of subjectivization. And this is what I liked about your point about administration and managing and technocracy. There is this attitude of looking at other subjects as, other subjects in your society as needing to be managed. And often the word educate is used to stand in for manage rather than give someone an opportunity to live a form of life that can meaningfully change what they're able to do and increase their capacities and their ability to think. They think in terms of how do we subject this person to a set of experiences that will cause them to adopt a prefabricated view that we've decided is the correct view. That's not education. That's giving somebody a dogma, not giving them a capacity to think for themselves. And this is a kind of attitude that is very managerial and very common. And it's common not just among people who do management, but also among people who have not succeeded as becoming managers, but sympathize with managers, identify with managers, have taken their cultural and aesthetic cues about what's cool and what's good and what's not good from managers.
Who probably thought they were going to be managers and can't find a job, and now they can fantasize about putting people in re-education camps in their communist, world revolution.
Yeah.
Rough, but that hits deep. That hits deep. It does. And it's that managerial tendency is baked into progressivism. And then the origin of progressivism, we have to remember, was progressivism was created as an anti-socialist movement. It was an attempt to curb the rise of the labor movement, to manage the labor movement. That's why Woodrow Wilson, opposed the, he opposed the labor movement, but he wanted to co-opt socialism. He wasn't the first. Bismarck did that. This runs really deep, and progressivism is a kind of broader attitude that, let's enlighten society, but let's do so not by, actually advancing people's capacities, but by warping them. And it's where you get attitudes about human nature being something that's totally static, and you can mold them into whatever.
Yeah,
and a lot of leftists do adopt that kind of view.
And it's crazy overclaiming also just about what you can know and about the degree to which you can know what's in other people's minds and what other people need, what's good for other people. It's very difficult to know how to treat somebody in such a way that they are benefited or improved in terms of their character, in terms of their way of being in the world. It's a very difficult thing to figure out how to do. You have to actually know that person as a specific person to be able to make a judgment about how to treat them. You can't just apply ideal types across the board and use this to machine everybody into a particular view. It's not just that it's a cruel thing that treats people as objects, although of course it is that. It's also that it is based on tremendous hubris and pride and false feelings of superiority that will often result in something that is not at all the intended result. A lot of the time when you try to subjectivize a population in a particular way, you end up with something very different from what you intended.
Yep. It doesn't even work. It's not even just that it's cruel. It doesn't often work. And the communist countries did this the most aggressively. The ones, especially when they were into central planning and all that. And, James Burnham points this out in the Managerial Revolution, but, he became a right winger, so we can't cite him. But okay, let's take it from a left-leaning anarchist adjacent thinker, seeing James C. Scott and seeing like a state makes very similar points about how, this managerial logic is, people adopting the logic of states at a subjective level, and believing that all problems can happen if you just make people the way that the rulers want to make them into. And you might think that the current regime doesn't do it right, and that if we got in power, we do it better. part of where I inherited this sort of critique of this managerialism, a lot has to do with one of my biggest influences, which is Sheldon Wolin, which to me was such a huge, like, spoke to me at such a big level coming from the managerial world. His sort of analysis, Sheldon Wolin, was a really unique perspective for me because he was someone who, leaned in a kind of democratic socialist position, which is why Chris Hedges promoted him a lot. But Wolin himself was idiosyncratic for today's leftist standards in that he had attitudes to cosmopolitanism that were seen to be reactionary by a lot of leftist academia, including one of his own mentors says that about him. It's not one of his mentors, it's one of his own students, Wendy Brown. That he had like localist views, because think about Wolin is he made this point about immigration very early on, was that, if you can really only do politics at a democratic politics beyond you can only do it at a certain level. Like you can only truly have participatory democracy at local levels, and you can only have people participate in even national levels with a polity that is, integrated, educated, and has a certain sense of genuine and civic involvement. And that's only possible with time. If you have a lot of people who don't really belong to any place, all in stacked together, you don't have even mass politics. You have like swarms. And it's also depoliticizing. He saw cosmopolitanism as fundamentally depoliticizing. And part
Well,
of my experience with this is in the universities. What I always hated
yeah,
was that they had these institutions of like, not institutions, these groups that would try almost to segregate people. It'd be like the Iranian Student Society, the Chinese Student Society, Korean Student Society, the Muslim Student Society, the Christian. And as a multiracial person, I always found this annoying because I couldn't fit into any of them. But I also thought this is profoundly bad for integration. Like, don't you
yeah,
want the people to fucking mingle and get to know each other to become Canadian citizens?
yeah. If I were, in charge and I could do whatever I wanted, I would ban all ethnic and national and based student societies on university campuses. I would just ban them. I wouldn't permit them. But of course, I am not in charge. And if I were to try to do that, I would be kicked out. Yeah, anyone who attempted to do that on a university campus would not be able to stay in office for any length of time. I do think that to have a capacity to differentiate locally, you do have to be protected from the competitive pressures that typically cause localities to all behave the same. And that's where real internationalism, not the post-Cold War institutions, but something that is designed to facilitate differentiation, that could really be transformative. Kind of cosmolocalism, where the purpose of the cosmo is to make the local meaningful. That could be very different. But unfortunately, we're in this situation where the cosmo appears to be an attack on the human. There seems to be something anti-human about post-World War II institutions. And as a consequence of this, the commitment to them is waning, and yet there doesn't seem to be an alternative to them. And if you break them apart without planning ahead, it causes a lot of chaos in terms of security and then also in terms of economic output. So people seem trapped between, on the one hand, defending these institutions, which are homogenizing and dehumanizing, or on the other hand, attacking these institutions, but often on the basis of a kind of unilateral go it alone strategy that isn't ultimately going to be viable at producing a sustainable form of life.
A post-liberal international world order, perhaps. At a smaller scale, the EU seems to be trying to move in that direction to maintain the EU while reforming its immigration policy to deal with the problem, which I think we're going to
Yeah, they
see
need to
more of.
change their structure, though, not just the policy. The institutions need to be different,
Oh, that's
ultimately, to
much
be
harder.
able to sustainably produce different results. What they are instead going to do is they're going to try to keep people supporting these institutions by moderating the policy.
Changing the institution would be way harder. But first off, the EU is
Yeah,
just so oligarchic and
course.
undemocratic. That's the biggest issue is like, people really do not have much of a say and ultimately with
these incredibly technocratic, venal, the golden handcuffs. It seems like you can't do without the EU economically. It seems like you can't do without NATO, and you can't do without the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO. And yet, we do ultimately have to have a different international system if we want the rules to look different. So at some point, that would have to come into the horizon. But what everyone wants is some magical fairy tale story where we keep all of the post-World War II institutions, but somehow purify them and make them all compatible with whatever it is that we like. Nobody wants to actually think through, what does it mean to move on from the WTO? What does it mean to move on from the United Nations as a structure? What does it mean to have something that actually can work at that kind of scale, that makes it possible for countries to really differentiate and to decide, hey, we like this kind of thing or that kind of thing. We want to promote this kind of art or science or what. Let countries make real choices about what to do. Let cities do it. Let towns do it. But to do it, they have to not be immediately punished by the market or punished by the threat of military invasion. That's what our whole world runs on, the threat of those two things.
Part of the reluctance, right, to restructure the EU is because, people can't think of a way to have a different international order without not having the EU. It's either like you leave it, and the problem is, Europe, without an institution that facilitates international cooperation, has had, quite a tumultuous history. In many ways, Europe was what, people imagine Africa to be, in that, have constant unstable states fighting over territory all the time and constant wars. And Europe's geography does, make that very likely. Is so much contested territory. And, you think about it, it took 2 world wars to really have stability in the region.
Right.
So
So, of course, nobody wants to open the Pandora's box and talk about changing all of that stuff. And then people say they want socialism. And people say they want, a just world where people are not compelled to work by the threat of starvation or the threat of medical costs. These things don't go together. Ultimately, we can't be afraid to make new institutions as people. Can't be afraid to build new things. And there's a lot of pretending that we're interested in building stuff that as soon as you run up against, the real challenges and questions of doing that, it all falls away. There's so much talk and professing to be radical on the internet. And then when it actually comes to, okay, then, are we going to make something new? Everybody chickens out. Because people don't trust themselves. After World War II, it's understandable. After World War II and the Soviet Union, why would people trust themselves to make anything new? Last time people tried to make fundamentally new and different institutions, some of the worst things that have ever happened we can possibly conceive of occurred. So it's very scary and intimidating to take seriously that possibility.
Right. Fascism.
Stalinism. All of it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. If if you're seen to have any policy that wants to scale back on the globalist multicultural project, it's seen as fascism. It could open the door to fascism. If you want to have any socialism, you're seen as opening the door to Stalinism. So, I think that's binary thinking. Really, clearly we have to deal with these problems.
But it comes from a unitary source, which is fear of what really happens if we change this thing. We've naturalized at this point the post-war order. It's been 70, 80 years almost? 80 years since the post-war order was created. And so on the one hand, this is just everything that everybody who's alive knows now. Nobody who's alive and active in society or politics knows about the pre-World War II world, has any concept or notion of what it was like. And yet at the same time, there's all this literature that comes down to us that says it's incredibly dangerous to mess with any of this. You have no idea what you potentially unleash if you change any of these things. But how can the greatest generation and the silent generation put all of that stuff together? How can they bind humanity for all of eternity in a set of post-World War II structures? They surely can't. They surely won't ultimately. But it still seems that for a while here, everybody is much too scared to really change anything.
The saddest thing I find is that when it comes to all the factions, left, center, liberals, conservatives, leftists seem to be by far lagging behind the most, and the most unlikely to be in any sort of position of power where they could play any role in restructuring this. That like, what if there was a, opportunity to restructure the world order? You'd want to have if you're leftist and you want any kind of chance of it, any socialism having a remote chance, you'd want to have socialist parties in power, and socialists can't win power because their policies are out of touch with people and their rhetoric's out of touch with people. And the biggest thing I think is on that front of immigration. One argument we didn't deal with, and this is the counter argument I hear all the time from leftists. This is, this is not a problem. If you talk about the problem, you're playing into the right's moral panic. They always say it's a moral panic. And that once you have social democracy or socialism, or if you're a liberal, you say once the GDP goes up, then people will stop complaining. But then no, let's thought experiment again. If one system is predicated on living standards constantly moving up, then it's not a sustainable system, even by their own logic, which if they're environmentalists, how does that make any
It's a contradiction if they're degrowth, but also they think we
right?
should support immigration for GDP reasons. That would be a quite serious contradiction. I hope there are not too many people who are really espousing both of those views at the same time. That would be
There's
quite
many. I would say a lot of them.
oof.
There's serious contradiction. Look, the more I've looked into the left, the more I've seen there's serious contradictions in the right too. But the thing about why I focused on the left is because you're the guys who want to change things so much. If you want to change things, you need responsibility for dealing with the ramifications of that change and how that could possibly happen. For parts of the right, unless you're on the radical right, they have responsibility too. If it's just more the conservative, it's a little bit easier to just, be defined in opposition to like change. Okay, we want to keep things the same. In some sense, the far right does need radical responsibility even more, given their track record when they're in power, right? The far right has a pretty bad track record. Like when I'm talking the far right, the actual far right, you know. But like there are serious issues and contradictions, and we're not even touching the whole realm of gender policy. I think the gender policy question and the question of feminism, the feminism and the gender world collide so heavily, where the contradictions are so obvious, and that's why they're playing out so viciously between parts of the feminist movement and parts of the LGBTQ stuff, and that's
Oh
because
boy, that's a whole nother
the whole
conversation. We
other
should
we're
do
not gonna
that
we're
a
not gonna
different
talk about
episode
that.
on that.
But the
We
point
should do
is
that separately.
the point is there are deep contradictions that need discussion and not talking about them because we need to stop thinking and fight the right. I'm sick of this popular frontist mentality. This mentality that it's like fight the right and you're a leftist by your opposition to the right, and you end up taking opposite positions that the right does because that's how you define your politics. You end up with a lot of confusing positions. You end up with degrowth, yet also we need to not deal with immigration because it's good for the economy. You
Yeah,
end up just with
there's a taboo on really thinking about anything. Because if you think about stuff too much, you run into the serious limitations of the structure that we have. This is a very limited structure. They built a very capacious playground for us at the end of World War II. It's a very capacious playground. And at the end of the Cold War, the playground expanded. And now everybody's in it. And it seems to offer a lot of possibility, but there is something about adult life that is not fully possible within the constraints of the post-World War II playground.
before we end off, I'll tell you, here's my fantasy cope that I hope will lead to this getting a little better. Okay. So, a lot of what I think is this you talk about in your book, the fallen professionals, some have called it elite overproduction, right? When you have overproduction of people who are supposed to be in the professional managerial class who don't, you get this sort of fallen professional politics that metastasizes, and what we see. They want to float their symbolic capital in ways and justify their education. And you get this kind of politics. You also get these views that don't make sense on the left that collide heavily with the constituencies that they're supposed to be representing and fighting for. I wonder if AI, part of me hopes, like, maybe AI will proletarianize parts of the white collar professional jobs so much to a point where, people are forced to actually like socialize with working class people, who don't have college degrees. And, even if that does happen, I think it'll get a lot worse before it gets better because, that means more fallen professionals. They're gonna have to sit with that reality for a while before they have to reckon with the rest.
I think that in practice, they could put off reckoning with the rest more or less indefinitely. I think really
You
the
think
effect
so?
is to lumpenize rather than to proletarianize. What do people tend to do? They, at this point, most of the
And
workers
a
in
lot of the
our
workers are
society who have
lumping that.
college degrees depend on corporate entities for work. And what they do is they beg corporate entities for jobs and they write long cover letters begging these corporate entities to give them work. And they file these grants and they file effectively petitions to impersonal entities for money. There's a lot of begging for money that people with degrees do all the time. And it looks much more like lumpen behavior. It's like people begging for money on the street. It's like people begging for handouts, but call it work and beg for it. It doesn't look a lot like traditional proletarian labor. People would like it too. People tried to frame it that way. But if you think about how much of
It's more
white
like
collar
gig labor.
education is about trying to get away with stuff, how much of it is about bullshitting and pretending you've done things you haven't done and that you can do
True.
things that you probably can't do.
Writing essays about stuff
It's
you don't know.
right. There's a lot of kind of lumpen, scammy, let me see if I can get some money off these people behavior that goes on in the white collar, bureaucratic, university educated world. There's a lot of it. And
They're
people
the
take
best
pride in
bullshitters.
being able to convince other people to give them money when they don't do very much in return for it. There's a lot of that behavior that goes on. I call it the honors kid mentality. The honors students
Mm.
in American high schools are expert scammers. They just scam their teachers continuously. They're smarter generally than their teachers are, and they find ways to convince their teachers they've done work they've not done. This is what American schools are really good at producing, excellent scammers. And they produce a
So
very large number of them. And then these people call themselves workers, but it's part of a scam, really. At the end of the day, most of them are begging for money from impersonal entities. They are not performing socially necessary labor in many cases. Of course, there are some that do. And of course, I'm not saying that service work isn't real work or that work in finance or work in advertising isn't real work. It is, and it contributes to the economy insofar as it generates consumption. I'm not saying that service work or that more abstract work can't be real work. It is. But there's also a lot of work that is
a lot
just
of bullshit
bullshit job
jobs.
stuff.
A lot of bullshit.
There's a lot of that isn't even really meaningfully contributing to service activity, but it's just a justification for giving somebody money so that they can buy stuff and contribute to consumption.
Oh, a lot of that in finance because every time you invest in a company, that company has to justify and tell their shareholders every month what it's doing with that new investor money. And they hire all these PR teams filled with people who really, a lot of them don't need to be there. They create new bureaucracies. There's all of that.
And if you seem to be doing something that's related to a cause that somebody feels good about giving money to, the whole NGO industrial complex relies on creating feel goods for rich people might not actually translate into very much in reality. People donating money to organizations that turn out to be very inefficient. They create a whole website to try to monitor how efficient these charities are and to what degree they're scam organizations. Because, of course, all of these charities pay the people who run them enormous amounts of money and not to generate a profit. But what's the function of the charity? The function of the charity is to create a tax break for the person who donates the money and to make those people feel better about themselves in some way for having done so. And you can be very good at making your donors feel good about what they've done without necessarily doing very much with their money.
I think, to leave people with something, maybe that is a feel good, but not a feel good based in a total lie. I really think that whatever, there'll be no. So this is a conversation I want to save for another thing, which is, what does strategy mean? Because, I think we're wrong. We're used to talking about the movement or a movement when it's in the age we're in, you call it deep pluralism, that is unlikely to. It's unlikely to be that way. And I know, to the extent that it was ever really that way, it's questionable. There'll be movements. What does politics look like? I think we should, because I ended up writing something. I could send it to you. I didn't. It's not ready at all to be published or anything. But it's about, what is like political organizing look like in the age of deep pluralism? Because I thought a lot about politics, right? Like politics being the activity of being able to make decisions on things despite disagreement. Not this idea of getting a bunch of people who disagree, coming up with a consensus, and then deciding, or somehow defeating all the people who disagree and winning. Like, fight the right.
A decision despite
You're
disagreement.
gonna have to work with the right. You're
Yeah.
gonna have to work with the right. People don't want to hear it. You're gonna have to work with the right. Okay? You're gonna have to work with liberals. You're gonna have to work with religious people. That's just the reality. This world where this idea of like, no, you can't give in, like this fantasy that
Just
everyone.
wait for the demographics to change and for the discourse sorcery to transform everybody into a universal subject. This waiting, it's not working out for anybody.
Or this idea that the anti-migrant wave is driven somehow by people like Trump and Nigel Farage, like as if it's them who are just as
It comes
individual.
from the people. Yeah, their charisma is somehow working some sort of magic voodoo on
Right.
everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like these people can only ever appeal to something that people are thinking and not saying. And I have to say, when it comes to the immigration stuff, I was thinking it for a while. I just didn't really like think of it as much until the discourse started being it. And the way discourse works, it is like it amplifies, and it has a sort of, I'm trying to look for a word, like exponential effect. And that the more people talk about it, the more people who might have thought about it but weren't really thinking about it have vocabulary to think about it. And that's very important. And insofar as we play a role, like, what do we do? Right? What do people who do media and commentary do? I like to think that what I do is you help give a vocabulary to understand these things and to really understand them, not to just cope about it. Because without it, if you don't have an alternative way to understand things like immigration, for example, and if your response is just to say, oh, racist, bad, fascist, reactionary, then the only vocabulary people will have to understand it who aren't already, leftists who have swallowed all the cope are going to be people who listen to Nigel Farage, Carl Benjamin, and people who will say, we don't have the solutions to everything, but we just want to close the border and have mass deportations. They're saying something. They're saying something. And unless we deal with this in a way that actually goes beyond and goes at a deeper level to the root causes, you're going to be left with that. That's going to win. There's no way you're going to win. This is not just a phase. This is not just a phase of like people who are mad about immigration because of some right-wing propaganda. In the way that the gender wars, I should say, the gender wars aren't just Andrew Tate. The way adolescents tried to portray what is happening between men and women and young boys and young girls, as if it's just some kind of like digital thing.
There's real changes that are taking place as a consequence of the way in which the world has been mismanaged by institutions that are not fully functional, failed predictably in reliable ways. You're not going to be able to deal with this purely at the level of, oh, these people are bad for having said bad things. That's just not going to get it done.
In my book, I quote Wallen's definition that theory, insofar as it has any use, is vocabulary to understand reality and a particular phenomenon. It's language. It's useless when it's self-referential. And he came up with managed democracy as a concept because he didn't find dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist state, or this neutral idea of democracy to be very satisfactory in understanding what is happening, right? Like what do we have? And that's an example of a useful theory, in my opinion. We come up with terms insofar as they're useful, and I like to think that's what we're trying to do. Is to talk about these things in a way that can actually help people understand them and maybe talk about other people they know instead of being the kid at the dinner table who's like, can't talk to your uncle who might have, bigoted beliefs. And if you do talk to him, you just dismiss him as a racist, right?
Yeah. Can we get to a stage where we can describe this in a way that isn't about trying to identify who's bad or who did the bad things in the past? Can we talk about this in a way that is about trying to understand a structural problem and then thinking through what might be the sequence of things that might need to be done to unblock it? Can we do that? Are we able to do that at any level? Even if it's just a small number of us who are at least able to think about it and talk about it a bit. We might be very far away from being able to do anything socially or politically with that. But can we at least, have a conversation that isn't so dominated by this attempt by people to win and defeat others? How about a conversation that isn't about trying to beat the enemy? How about that? How about a conversation that doesn't assume the friend-enemy distinction at the beginning? How about that? Let's not be Schmittian all the time. How about that? Let's start with that.
Sometimes I have to say, I have a habit when talking to people who I know are likely left-leaning leftists. I tend to sometimes frame it as winning because it's the only way they can fucking understand that they need to do self-criticism and self-reflection because they can only think of things as like, oh, you're either giving into the right or not. I like to think my audience is smarter than that. But the thing is, a lot of people are conditioned, especially on the left, who I think swallow more ideology actually than the average person due to the fact that one, they are more educated. So by definition, they consume more knowledge. So that knowledge means you're not immune to propaganda. And also they tend to develop the vocabulary and sophistication to justify things they already want to believe. So it's why they end up being more actually, coping than someone who might not have education, have a degree at all. So it's like, that's why some stuff that should be so easy, like we should have conversations with people who have different political views, but that gets seen as, oh, you're acquiescing to the right. But look, even if you don't, even from the standpoint of you don't want the far right to win, you know what? You need to have a fucking conversation if you even want to think about that. So it's like even on the left's own kind of Schmittian terms, it needs to not be Schmittian.
Even to think about tactics, you would have to begin from, they don't spend, generals, when they are fighting wars, they don't spend the whole meeting going, the other side is very bad. You better not attribute to them any capacity to do anything offensively that would be effective, because to do that is to concede to them at the level of ideas. If I'm commanding some tank unit in World War II and I go, the Wehrmacht tanks, they can't possibly take any positive initiative because that would be to concede something to the Germans, that they're capable of things.
Yeah, nuclear bombs are bad. We shouldn't have nuclear bombs because they have
It concedes something to other people to say otherwise. Sometimes people get to a stage where they can't talk about reality.
The last thing I'll say, because I just forgot to bring it up as a point, is the unwillingness to have that conversation is a sort of symptom of broader depoliticization.
Yeah, it's in part because the conversations don't seem to actually matter, don't seem to be effective, that they can become psychological palliatives. What's the purpose of talking about politics? It's not because you're going to do anything. So it becomes a way of feeling better about your life, feeling better about than the people around you. It becomes about being at peace with the situation, often in part by criticizing it or adopting a radical pose in relation to it.
Yeah, it's like on the one hand, you have the kind of like I've always found it annoying, like the saying, it's like, oh, you should never talk about politics at a dinner table. It's like in principle, it's like you should be able to talk about it in a smart way, but probably why that idea came up is probably because of leftists who are very annoying at dinner tables, who are like want to make everyone feel like shit because they're not educated or enlightened enough,
Yeah, if you
according to
can't
them.
talk about politics and religion at the dinner table, you really
That's your
need to
fault.
do
Yeah.
work needs to be done.
No, I've always found like I've met so many people who are like right leaning who I found perfectly fine to talk about, fine to talk to. Like it shouldn't be that difficult. But this question of depoliticization is related to the broader activity of being a citizen. Being a citizen and being political, I think, are very connected. Because in practice, while it's easy to be a rootless cosmopolitan if you are in a hyper urban area and travel the world, ultimately you're a citizen of only a few countries, if not just one, usually just one for most people. You can only really have the power to change things in that particular place where you're a citizen of. And that relates, kind of, it's the 360, the theme of the episode, immigration. Part of the other thing that I've always found part of annoying, a thing just I found impulsively just or instinctively very annoying with the way in which Canada started to do immigration, which is why I like assimilation immigration as opposed to this idea of like multiculturalism in a segregated way, was due to its profoundly depoliticizing effect. What I would always find annoying is like, you know, if I met, especially I find this with, students, especially in the universities, if they're from different countries, what always rubbed me the wrong way is never if they like skin color of any sort. Because I've always I've had friends from different ethnicities. It was if they had like no clue about anything in Canada, they were clueless about the prime minister or prime ministers or what was going on in the country. They're like, oh, politics, and I found this very common with very unassimilated immigrants. Whereas, you would find with second generation immigrants, often the case, they usually are they, become familiar and they're active citizens. But with second generation, it's first generation, it's harder, but it's often like not impossible. For example, I like to bring up this case of my dad. My dad assimilated into Quebec as an Arab. And that's the hardest place you could assimilate in Canada, Quebec, which they're the people who are really convinced and their distinctiveness from the rest of Canada. He was able to do it there. He voted in elections when he became a citizen. He's a first gen immigrant. I actually became, ended up working for the Canadian government. There's also just funny stories I could mention here and there about actually meeting just Pierre Trudeau on the street by accident, a kind of funny story. But okay, it is very possible for people of all races and ethnicities and cultures to assimilate, but it requires time and it requires the incentive. You need to actually have people who are foreigners be integrated with, you know, people. And that requires, yes, the people I think you should be actually accepting. You shouldn't just be like, oh, you're an outsider, ew, no, don't talk to them. I think I've always been against that attitude. You should wanting to be welcoming, but you can only welcome and have so many people and have it work.
Yeah. There are certain
That's the point.
mathematical limitations. That's all. Just certain mathematical limitations. It's much more of a math problem than it is a problem of fundamental or essentially distinct anything.
Yeah, you do not want to have a situation where you have so much of the population who is so depoliticized and has no connection to the country they're in. It's like you don't if you don't have a because there really you remember this. Might sound ridiculous to some people. There really was people who believed assimilation was racist or chauvinist or against culture somehow. Oh, you're making people dissolve their culture by assimilating to a place they're migrating to. It's ridiculous because if you don't have assimilation to some extent culturally, You just don't have
A part of
politics. You don't have a society.
part of the idea is that they don't think that the immigrants have a choice about the move. They think that they have to move, and therefore they shouldn't have to change the culture because they've been forced to move. One of the things we need to do is give people a right to stay, give people a real material basis so that they can stay in the countries that people are coming from, make those countries orderly and stable so people have a choice. And if they want to stay and they don't want to potentially learn how to get along with people who are different from them in a different part of the world, they have the option to stay where they are and not go through that process. And that is why putting a stop to these events that generate refugee crises is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. And generating enough economic growth and development in poorer parts of the world so that people have the option to stay is absolutely essential. The right to stay makes it such that you can demand assimilation because those who leave have left by a decision, and therefore their decision to leave can mean that they are obligated to assimilate.
Precisely. It's only going to get worse with climate refugees. And hey, here's the thought. What if people on the left, instead of talking about climate changes, saving the planet in this weird hippie white liberal guilt way, instead, part of a way to convince people on the right, not in this Brahmanistic way that, oh, you're not respecting the sacred land by, supporting oil. Instead, maybe, I'm sure you could convince a lot of people that a very big reason to deal with climate change in a non-reactive way. Well, at this point, it is reactive or well past. No, but like at least in a somewhat,
Has sailed.
you need to just deal with it soon. And you need to, really be pragmatic too in terms of like what solutions you're willing to consider in terms of energy sources that create the least amount of damage possible. Because if you don't, you're going to get these climate refugees. And what are you going to do? Shoot them all with
Yes.
machine guns at the border?
Climate change and refugees are connected, and therefore it is, yes, that's definitely something that has to be borne in mind.
Anyway, this has been a very depressing but I think, very productive conversation. I can already anticipate it's going to be one of the One Dime Radio classics in that I think a lot of people will get a lot out of it in the sense that we are providing something, I do think, really, like that because I've paid a lot of attention to the sphere of left-coded influencers, because at this point, I don't even know what to say. Like, am I, part of the left? I don't know. These word categories are pretty meaningless to me at this point. But, I'm grouped in with, I am on the left. You're on the left, to a point, right? Even if we don't identify ourselves as leftists. We're at least providing something that I think is totally fucking lacking in this ecosystem. And I would like to see more of it. I would like to see people do the same, with their different ways.
Yeah, we have to be able to talk about these things. We have to be able to talk to people who do not have the conventional set of social views we associate with university campuses and big cities. It's got to be possible. There's not going to be any change of any kind that's of any value to anybody unless there's some capacity to talk across this stuff.
I have to say one more thing. Courage. Because what's also pissed me off? I've known behind the scenes certain creators, people who podcast, people who are influencers, thought leaders types, who actually do have what might seem right-coded views on some of these topics, or at least, when I say right-coded in the sense of they just don't have the typical leftist, liberal, progressive talking points, the dogmas, but they're totally afraid to say it. Yet they still remain silent because they're fucking audience captured and totally lack the balls whatsoever to fucking at all hit the hornet's nest. And that's also a problem. I think a lot of audience captured people.
Yeah, and if you're afraid of your audience, how are you supposed to lead anybody who's any different from you? How are you supposed to interface with anybody who's different from you? Your audience is the part of the population that's the most like you.
Exactly. Anyway, nice
Yeah.
to have you, Ben.
Yeah, it's been great to be on and to talk about all of these dark, depressing things. That's politics. That's what it is.
We'll see you in the next episode of the Studebaker One Dime Show. You know what we should call it? Studebaked. Get Studebaked. Because there's one guy who always comments
Studebaked.
that on every episode we do. I'm about to get Studebaked. That's a funny idea to call it.
That is fun.
If you enjoyed this exclusive episode of One Dime Radio, the Backroom exclusive podcast for patrons only, then I recommend that you become a patron if you haven't already, because you will be getting content like this on a weekly basis. This is the kind of stuff that the people who are regular patrons get access to, and I'm sure they'll tell you that it's well worth it. You also get access to my private Discord server, where you can chat with other viewers, but most of all, you get access to well over 80 exclusive podcast episodes at this point. And by the time you're listening to this, who knows, there might be well over 100 exclusive episodes. And each episode is not merely the second half of podcasts I do, it's an entirely different topic that you can listen to at a different time. So I structure it so that people can listen to it really whenever they want. And it's usually on issues that are quite evergreen and won't age badly. Thank you very much to the patrons who have supported this podcast and the One Dime channel so far, and see you in the back room on Patreon.
Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I am sick and tired of revolutionaries or protest movements which focus on those ecstatic moments. Oh my God, 1 million people on Syntagma Square, on Tahrir in Istanbul, and so on. We were all so enthusiastic there, and so on and so on. I'm not impressed by that at all. I think this is even relatively easy to do. The true test of a revolution or radical social change is how do ordinary people experience the change when the ecstatic moment is over, when things return to normal. That's the most difficult task. When nothing happens, when just everyday life is here, how is this everyday life different from the previous everyday life?